The danger began with a whisper, a soft, sweet vapor that curled through Victorian bedrooms and operating theatres like a perfumed serpent. Chloroform, they called it. A miracle, a blessing, a way to slip the human body into perfect, obedient silence. But London learned quickly that this silence had teeth. One moment you were awake beneath the glow of a gas lamp. The next, the world folded shut, your breath fluttering on the edge of nowhere, your life balanced on the steadiness of another person's hand. Doctors praised it, society women indulged in it, criminals discovered it, and across Britain the same chilling truth spread. A few drops of this sweet-smelling liquid could take away pain or take away you. Before we descend into the shadows of chloroform's rise, its victims, and the panic it unleashed, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from. Your support helps us keep uncovering the eerie secrets Victorian Britain tried so hard to hide. Now breathe in, carefully. The story begins where consciousness ends. The cloth trembled very slightly in the surgeon's gloved hand, though no one in the gaslit theatre would ever dare suggest that a man of his stature could be nervous. It was folded neatly, as if prepared for a dinner service rather than the ritual now taking place. Upon it glistened several fresh drops of a clear liquid, innocent-looking, almost elegant, yet carrying with it the soft, perfumed danger that London's hospitals were only beginning to understand. The scent drifted upward in a faint mist, mingling with the warmth of the lamps and the cold tang of metal instruments. It moved like something alive, curling, tasting the air, before settling upon the patient who lay rigid on the operating table. The young woman's breath came quick and shallow. She stared at the ceiling, its ornate plaster rosettes swimming in her vision, her fingers gripping the blanket so tightly that her knuckles glowed white. She had been promised relief, promised a kind of mercy unknown to patients of previous decades who had been forced to clench their teeth and scream until their voices failed. This new miracle, the surgeon had said, would carry her into a gentle sleep while the knife did its work. A kindness, he called it, a gift of modern science. But as the cloth descended, releasing its floral sweetness, she could not decide whether the scent comforted her or unsettled her. It was like breathing in wilted petals after a funeral, soft, cold, heavy. "Just a moment more," the surgeon murmured, as if speaking to a child. His voice carried the soothing tone of a man who had repeated the same assurance dozens of times, though faint tremors along his jaw betrayed the truth. Even he did not yet fully trust the vapor he held. No one did, not truly. The cloth pressed lightly over her mouth and nose. At first, the air tasted wrong, as though the world itself had shifted. Then came the warmth, a strange, floating sensation, as if her thoughts were drifting gently away down some quiet corridor. Voices blurred. The stiffness left her hands. Her mind loosened its grip on the room, on the lights, on the faces leaning over her. The surgeon gave a quiet nod to the nurse, who stepped closer with the tray of instruments. "Good," he whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. Yet beneath his calm expression, something flickered an unease, as delicate as the sweet vapor that now filled the patient's lungs. He had heard the stories whispered in the staff quarters. Patients who had slipped too far, whose breaths had thinned into silence, records altered, explanations softened, deaths attributed to weak constitutions or unforeseen complications. Words chosen carefully, always carefully, to avoid admitting that perhaps the miracle was not as benevolent as it seemed. Around the table, the other physicians watched with an almost reverent stillness. The nurse's hands stayed folded at her waist, though her eyes never left the patient's chest, counting each rise and fall. The porter at the back of the room stiffened whenever the breathing faltered, his grip tightening on the stretcher he might soon be called upon to use. The surgeon lowered the cloth slightly, inspecting her face. Her lashes had settled, her lips parted in a faint sigh. The vapor had carried her away swiftly, silently, completely. Too completely? A heartbeat passed. Then another. Outside, a gust of London fog pressed against the window panes, rattling them softly. The lamps flickered. Somewhere in the corridor beyond the theatre, a patient moaned. But in this room, there was only the hush of chloroform, an unnatural calm. Heavy as velvet, the surgeon finally set the cloth aside. "Begin," he said, though his voice had thinned, barely more than a thread. The first incision was made. No scream followed, no cry of shock or pain. Only the faint, rhythmic breathing of a woman suspended between waking and oblivion, held there by a substance so deceptively gentle, so perfumed and sweet, that Victorian Britain embraced it long before it understood the price. And as the surgeon worked beneath the wavering gaslight, none of them could know that this quiet moment, this soft, sugar-scented silence was the beginning of an era that would both elevate and haunt their world for decades to come. The scent drifted long before the surgeon entered, seeping through the narrow halls of the infirmary like a ghost that had learned how to linger. It clung to the wooden banisters, settled into the wool coats of passing orderlies, and wove itself into every lantern-lit corner. Some described it as floral pleasant. Even yet, there was always something slightly off about it, as though the sweetness hid a bruise beneath its petals. Chloroform had a way of announcing itself without any voice at all, a wilting bouquet laid upon a sickbed, a whisper that no one invited, but all recognized. Nurses, walking their rounds at dawn, spoke of the vapor as though it were a visitor. "He's been at it again," one might mutter, pausing outside the theatre door to fan the air with her handkerchief. Another would nod, eyes weary from hours spent tending to pale figures who drifted in and out of troubling dreams. They all agreed on one thing: wherever the scent thickened, sleep followed, and not always the kind that promised waking. In those early days of its fashionable ascent, Londoners found themselves drawn to chloroform's contradictions. It was delicate yet forceful, beautiful yet sinister, a perfume that could cradle you into rest or smother you without warning. Even the morgue attendants, hardened men who had seen every manner of death, noticed a new uniformity in the patients brought to them, a faint, lingering sweetness, a stillness too complete, as if the departed had been lulled away rather than claimed by illness or injury. On Chancery Lane, a physician named Dr. Whiting stood in the doorway of his surgery, watching as the morning fog curled around lampposts and the scent of the city mingled with something softer, stranger. He had used chloroform only 3 times, each with results that unsettled him. The first patient, a cobbler with a shattered ankle, had slept peacefully through the operation, awaking groggy but alive. The second, a housemaid, had taken longer to breathe steadily again. The third, a young barrister with a minor wound, slipped into unconsciousness so readily that for several terrifying seconds Dr. Whiting feared he had lost him entirely. Yet every one of them praised the experience afterward. No agony, no struggling, no memories of the knife or the sutures. They smiled weakly as they thanked him, unaware that he had spent hours afterward pacing his study, replaying every breath they'd taken while the vapor filled their lungs. The public adored chloroform. They adored the idea of it, the elegance, the novelty, the effortless vanishing of pain. They wrote glowing accounts in newspapers describing the wonder of drifting off under a sweet-smelling haze. They compared it to sinking into a warm bath or slipping between freshly laundered sheets. Few questioned the cost. Fewer still understood that the same sweetness could drown them. Children picked up the scent on their fathers' coats and asked if the flowers in the hospital gardens had bloomed early. Wives caught traces of it on their husbands' collars and imagined prestige, progress, a step into the modern age. None suspected what it meant that chloroform had followed them home, hiding its warning beneath a veil of gentility. Even Dr. Whiting couldn't deny the allure. He lifted the small brown bottle from his shelf one evening, turning it in the lamplight. A delicate fog rose as he loosened the stopper. He brought the bottle closer, not to inhale, merely to examine, and yet the scent touched him anyway. Soft, cool, tempting. For a moment, he understood the devotion other surgeons felt. The vapor promised control, mastery over suffering, and the quieting of the human body with a grace that no other method had ever achieved. But beneath that promise was a tremor, a hint of something predatory, a sweetness that wanted more than to comfort, a silence that wished to linger. He replaced the stopper quickly. Outside, a carriage rattled past, leaving behind the sharp smell of horse and coal. But inside the surgery, the sweetness remained a reminder that chloroform did not need permission to haunt a place. It seeped into wood and wool and memory alike, waiting for the next breath, the next patient, the next moment when a doctor's hand would hover uncertainly between mercy and danger. London had taken its first deep inhalation of the new miracle. And now, whether it wished to or not, it was beginning to understand the after-scent. Long before the vapor drifted through London's hospitals and parlours, it settled first in the solemn stone rooms of Edinburgh Rooms, where curiosity pressed as heavily against the air as the Scottish fog outside. Here, in the winter-chilled chambers of the Royal Infirmary, physicians gathered around a small wooden table, their faces half-lit by wavering lamps. At the centre of that table rested a glass-stoppered bottle, no larger than a teacup, filled with a liquid that gave off a scent faintly reminiscent of crushed garden petals left too long in the cold. It was Dr. James Young Simpson who had summoned them, a man of brilliance, ambition, and the sort of confidence that comes from years of walking the border between discovery and danger. He stood near the hearth, hands clasped behind his back. His colleagues, Dr. Keith and Dr. Duncan, watched him with uneasy fascination. They trusted Simpson's intellect, but they also knew that new wonders often carried hidden claws. "We must understand it," Simpson said, his voice soft but charged. "Not through rumor, not through timid glances across the operating table. We must feel its effects ourselves." Self-experimentation was not uncommon among Victorian physicians, who frequently ingested, inhaled, or applied dubious substances in the name of progress. But something about this particular liquid, this chloroform, felt different. It hinted at depths of unconsciousness more profound than anything they had encountered. Simpson lifted the bottle, removing the stopper with a gentle twist. Immediately the room shifted. A sweet vapor rose like a pale ribbon, curling into the lamplight. Duncan coughed lightly. Keith turned his face away, though his eyes remained fixed on the bottle. "It is almost pleasant," Simpson murmured, inhaling more deeply than caution advised. "A softness, a warmth." Duncan hesitated. Or the beginning of suffocation dressed in perfume. But Simpson was undeterred. He folded a handkerchief, dripped several drops onto it, and pressed it to his face. The transformation was almost immediate. His shoulders slackened, knees softening as though sleep had reached up to catch him mid-breath. Keith rushed forward as Simpson swayed, lowering him into a nearby armchair just as the doctor's eyelids fluttered shut. Silence filled the room, broken only by the relentless ticking of the mantel clock. Simpson lay motionless, his chest rising and falling with eerie steadiness. His lips parted faintly. A faint smile, childlike, almost innocent, pulled at the corners of his mouth. Whatever world he wandered now, it was far removed from the firelit chamber. "James?" Keith whispered, leaning close. "Do you hear me?" No response. A full minute passed. Then another. At last, Simpson's fingers twitched. His breathing deepened. He blinked himself back into the world, like a man surfacing from the bottom of a still lake. Disoriented but exhilarated, he sat upright, clutching the armrests. "Gentlemen," he said, breathless, "we have found it, a perfect anesthetic." Yet, even in triumph, there was an unsettled shifting among the shadows. Duncan glanced at the cloth, at the bottle, at the lingering sweetness in the air. "Perfect," he echoed, though his tone carried more doubt than enthusiasm. "All perfectly dangerous." But Simpson would not be persuaded. Over the following days, he repeated the experiment on colleagues, on students, on unsuspecting visitors who trusted him implicitly. Each inhalation brought the same dreamlike drifting, the same seductive relief. Pain, he declared, had finally met its match. And still, no one could deny the unease. For with every demonstration, there came a moment, small but chilling, when the subject's breath seemed to hesitate, as though deciding whether to return. Edinburgh became the cradle of chloroform, its stone corridors echoing with newfound hope and quiet alarm. Physicians travelled from across Britain to witness its effects, some left inspired, others left disturbed. All carried with them the same stubborn scent, tucked into their coats like a secret: wilted flowers, sweet and bruised. Simpson believed he had lifted humanity into an age of painless surgery, but beneath the vapor's soft embrace, the seeds of catastrophe had already begun to stir. The incident began as so many Victorian curiosities did, with good intentions, polite company, and a touch of fashionable scientific enthusiasm. It was an evening gathering at the townhouse of Sir Reginald Pembroke, a man known in Edinburgh for his wealth, his impeccable manners, and his unshakable desire to impress. His parlour was a jewel box of velvet drapes, crystal decanters, and guests who delighted in discussing progress as though it were an exotic card game only the brightest minds could play. What better entertainment, Sir Reginald decided, than a demonstration of chloroform, the newest medical marvel whispered about from London to Leith. He had obtained a small bottle directly from a trusted apothecary, tucked it neatly into his breast pocket, and spent the afternoon rehearsing his presentation in the mirror. He imagined gasps of admiration, applause even. Progress, after all, was terribly fashionable. When the guests arrived, the parlour glowed with lamplight, turning dust motes into drifting flecks of gold. Ladies in silk gowns fanned themselves lazily. Gentlemen in starched collars gathered around the fireplace, discussing railways and empire. Even the servants lingered by the door, curious about the object Sir Reginald held so proudly in his hand. "Observe," he announced, holding up the glass vial as though it were a reliquary. "A miracle of modern science, chloroform." A murmur rippled through the room. The women leaned forward. The men exchanged approving nods. Here, they thought, was a gentleman ahead of his time. Sir Reginald produced a handkerchief embroidered with his initials and dripped a modest amount of the liquid onto its corner. The scent blossomed almost immediately, sweet, light, faintly intoxicating. A few ladies giggled behind their gloves. "My friends," he continued, basking in their delight, "this substance has already banished pain from the operating theatre. Imagine, no more screaming amputations, no more desperate writhing. Simply sleep. A gentle, dreamless sleep." He pressed the cloth delicately to his nose, intending only to demonstrate his bravery, the sort of harmless dab one might take of perfume. But chloroform was not perfume. The transformation startled the room. Sir Reginald's posture slackened. His voice, mid-sentence, dissolved into a soft exhale. The handkerchief slipped from his fingers as he swayed, collapsing backward into his armchair as though guided by invisible hands. Gasps erupted. A teacup shattered. One woman screamed. "Reginald," his wife cried, rushing to his side. But the gentleman did not stir. His eyes were closed, his limbs inert, his breath so shallow that for a harrowing moment it seemed to cease altogether. The scent of chloroform, once charming, now hung heavy and oppressive in the parlour, settling over the guests like a pall. Dr. Malcolm Firth, a mild-mannered physician who had come merely to enjoy a quiet evening, pushed through the panic. Kneeling beside Sir Reginald, he checked his pulse, leaning in so close that his spectacles brushed the man's collar. A long moment passed. "He's alive," Dr. Firth said at last, though uneasily, "but far too deeply under. How much did he inhale?" "Just a whiff," Lady Pembroke insisted, trembling. "Just the smallest amount." But chloroform did not measure itself by human caution. It took as much power as the lungs allowed. Dr. Firth ordered the windows thrown open. Cold air swept into the room, extinguishing a few candles, but reviving the frantic spirits of those watching. Minutes stretched like hours. At last, thank God, Sir Reginald's breath deepened. His eyelids fluttered. He stirred with a fragile groan, as though surfacing from a vast, blackened sea. When he finally sat upright, pale and bewildered, the entire room exhaled as one. The demonstration was over, but its consequences had only begun. By the following morning, half of Edinburgh had heard the tale of Sir Reginald Pembroke, the gentleman who slept too long. Some recounted it with amusement, others spoke of it in low, fearful tones. Physicians, in particular, took note. Chloroform, they realized, did not distinguish between the hospital and the drawing-room, between the surgeon's hand and the dilettante's curiosity, between necessary sleep and the kind that led elsewhere. And in that realization, a new shadow crept across Victorian Britain, the awareness that this miracle drug, sweet as crushed flowers, carried the quiet potential to seduce, silence, and, if given the slightest opportunity, steal breath altogether. The apothecary on Bishopsgate Street stood like a beacon for the curious, its windows crowded with blue glass vials, polished scales, and little handwritten labels boasting cures for every affliction known to Victorian Britain. By daylight it appeared reassuring, a place where science met remedy, where ailing clerks and weary seamstresses sought a measure of relief from the ceaseless grind of the city. But as twilight fell, and the lamplight shimmered against the glass, the shop took on a more enigmatic character. Shadows lengthened, bottles gleamed like watchful eyes, and at the center of the display, elevated on a velvet cushion, stood the newest marvel in medicine, a small, deceptively simple bottle marked chloroform. Its label was elegant, its contents clear as distilled hope. Passers-by paused to admire it, their reflections mingling with the bottle's faint sparkle. They saw in it the promise of painless dentistry, effortless childbirth, surgeries without screams, a modern miracle offered for a modest coin. What they did not see was the subtle tremor in the apothecary's hands each morning as he positioned the bottle just so, ensuring the sun would catch it. What they did not know was that he prayed quietly each night that buyers would use it sparingly, wisely, even though his livelihood depended on quite the opposite. Inside, the shop smelled of lavender, camphor, and chalk dust. Shelves lined with tonics and tinctures cast a cluttered mosaic of shapes upon the wooden counter. And behind that counter stood Mr. Elias Hardwick, a man whose spectacles had fogged so often from measuring volatile vapors that he had developed the habit of polishing them every few minutes. His eyes, pale, soft, perpetually tired, had watched the city's fascination with chloroform grow into a hunger far quicker than he had anticipated. He remembered the first bottle delivered to his shop, wrapped in thick paper, the apothecary stamp from Edinburgh still wet on the corner. He had opened it with reverence, inhaling the faint sweetness that rose like distant perfume. He imagined surgeons grateful, mothers restful, children spared terrible pain. But soon the buyers changed. They came with stories whispered behind lowered voices. A factory worker with a bruised jaw who insisted he needed it for tooth pain, though he avoided meeting Mr. Hardwick's gaze. A gentleman in an immaculate coat who purchased 3 bottles at once, claiming he had many friends in need of demonstration. A pale, trembling young woman who would not explain why she needed such a potent substance, nor why she kept glancing at the shop door as if someone were listening. And then there were the doctors, some cautious, some eager, some frighteningly cavalier. They bought chloroform with the confidence of men accustomed to controlling life and death. Yet even they sometimes hesitated, their fingers brushing the bottle's cool surface with something perilously close to fear. One crisp evening, just as fog began pooling along the cobblestones, a policeman entered the shop. His boots were damp, his expression grave. "Evening, Mr. Hardwick." "Constable," Hardwick replied, tightening his grip on the counter. He recognized the tone. It was the kind men used when tragedy demanded politeness. The constable lowered his voice. "There's been an incident. A child, 8 years old." He paused. "The attending physician believes chloroform may have been involved." Mr. Hardwick felt something cold settle beneath his ribs. "An accident?" he whispered. The constable did not answer directly. His silence was heavier than words. Instead, he removed his hat, nodding toward the bottle gleaming in the window. "You sell that," he said softly. "Be certain you know to whom." When he left, the doorbell chimed with a strangely mournful ring. Hardwick stood alone amid the scents of mint and ether, staring at the bottle in the window. It looked innocent enough, almost delicate. But beneath its glass walls swirled a force that neither he nor any man could truly command. Still, the bottle remained in its place. Customers continued to enter, coins continued to clink upon the counter, and the sweet, deceptive promise of chloroform continued to drift through the shop like a blessing wrapped in a curse. And every night, as Mr. Hardwick turned the key to lock his door, he wondered whether he was lighting the way for progress, or quietly stocking the shelves of a new Victorian danger, one bottle at a time. The childbirth had already lasted far too long. In a cramped brick house near Whitechapel, the air hung thick with steam, sweat, and the slow-burning oil of 2 flickering lamps. Outside, carts rattled over the cobblestones, their wheels echoing faintly through the narrow street. But inside, the world had shrunk to a single room, a single bed, a single woman writhing beneath linen sheets, dampened with fear and exhaustion. Mrs. Clarissa Haldane clutched the bedposts with white-knuckled desperation. Her hair lay plastered to her cheeks, her breaths sharp and ragged. Each contraction tore through her like a storm wave, leaving her trembling and disoriented. She had already been in labor for 17 hours, and her strength was ebbing. Beside her stood Miss Agnes Penwright, a midwife respected across the East End for her steady hands and calm voice. But tonight, her voice carried a tremor she tried and failed to conceal. She had used every traditional method at her disposal. Warm compresses, gentle encouragements, teas meant to steady the heart. Nothing eased the suffering. Nothing slowed the panic unraveling inside the small room. And then, as if summoned by the very desperation of the moment, the surgeon arrived. Dr. Elias Fortune swept into the room with a presence that commanded attention. He carried a leather bag whose brass latch gleamed ominously beneath the lamplight. The midwife recognized him not for his skill alone, but for his growing fascination with the new miracle drifting through London's medical circles. Chloroform. "We shall use the vapor," Dr. Fortune said, setting his bag on the table. Miss Penwright stiffened. "Sir, she is weak already." "All the more reason," he replied. "Pain is robbing her strength. Let the chloroform quiet her long enough for the birth to proceed." Quiet her. The words tasted wrong in the midwife's ears. But Mrs. Haldane, half delirious, nodded in exhausted surrender. "Anything," she whispered. "Please, anything." The doctor removed a folded cloth from his bag, so clean and white it seemed untouched by the world's realities. He uncorked a small bottle, and the scent rose immediately, sweet, delicate, almost tender. It floated through the air like a perfumed sigh, settling over the room with deceptive gentleness. The midwife watched in silence as he held the cloth just above the mother's face. "Breathe as normally as you can," the doctor instructed, though his voice wavered at the edges. Even he was still learning the boundaries of this dangerous gift. The vapor descended. At first, Clarissa's eyes fluttered, blinking at the strange fragrance. Her fingers loosened their grip on the bedposts. Her body, taut with agony, softened as though sinking into warm water. "It's working," Dr. Fortune murmured. But Miss Penright leaned closer, her instincts prickling. The mother's breaths were growing slower, too slow. Her chest rose and fell with unsettling irregularity. "Doctor," she began. "Hush, we must allow it to act." Clarissa's head lolled sideways, her lips parting in a faint, dreamlike sigh. And then silence. Not the silence of relief, the silence of breath gone faint enough to lose. The midwife's heart jumped. She pressed her ear near Clarissa's mouth, feeling only the gentlest brush of air. "Her breathing is faltering," she cried. "Please remove the cloth." Dr. Fortune stiffened. He had not wanted to believe the stories whispered in hospital corridors, but now those same fears flashed across his face. He snatched the cloth away, his hands trembling. For several terrible seconds, nothing happened. Then, as though drawn back from a great depth, Clarissa gasped a ragged, desperate sound that filled the room like a miracle and a warning all at once. Her eyes opened, unfocused but alive. Miss Penright exhaled shakily, tears pricking her eyes. The doctor swallowed hard, sweat beading at his brow. The baby arrived 20 minutes later, small but breathing, its first cry echoing against the narrow walls. The mother held the infant weakly, her body still trembling from what she had nearly lost. When Dr. Fortune packed his bag, he paused before leaving, staring at the bottle inside. "Use it sparingly," he whispered to the midwife. "God help us use it sparingly." But the midwife already knew. The sweet scent would linger in her memory forever, not just as a balm against suffering, but as the perfume of a boundary dangerously easy to cross. And so, in that tiny Whitechapel room, beneath the wavering light of 2 exhausted lamps, Chloroform made its first quiet descent into Victorian childbirth, promising mercy, delivering peril, and leaving behind the unmistakable fragrance of wilted flowers and nearly stolen breath. Long before chloroform seeped into tenements and hospital wards, it slipped quietly, elegantly, into the highest rooms of the British Empire. In Buckingham Palace, where the air smelled of polished mahogany and rosewater, whispers of the new anesthetic drifted in like a fashionable rumour. And at the centre of those whispers sat Queen Victoria herself, heavy with child and weary from the memory of 6 previous labours that had wrung her spirit like wet linen. It was the spring of 1853 when the matter was first brought before her. Outside, London bloomed with lilacs, but inside the palace, tension clung to the corridors like mist. Physicians moved with deliberate steps. Court ladies exchanged glances of cautious fascination. Even the footmen paused to listen when the word chloroform reached their ears, delivered in hushed tones by messengers from Edinburgh and whispered by servants who repeated everything without ever being asked. Dr. John Snow, already famed for his mathematical mind and quiet, studious manner, had been summoned to the palace for consultation. He stood in the Queen's sitting room, hands folded behind his back, speaking gently of vapours and safety and the promise of painless birth. His voice carried no theatricality, only a measured confidence that felt almost out of place among the palace's velvet drapes and golden trim. Queen Victoria, reclined upon a cushioned chaise, listened intently. Her face, softened by pregnancy yet sharpened by authority, revealed no fear, only curiosity. Pain had become a familiar enemy, one she met with stoic resolve. But now, for the first time, the possibility of avoiding that suffering shimmered before her like a candle in a cold church. "You believe this chloroform is safe?" she asked, her tone steady. "As safe as any substance can be when used with precision, Your Majesty," Dr. Snow replied. "Administered properly, it may afford great relief without undue risk." The Queen's ladies exchanged uneasy glances. Everyone in the room had heard the darker stories, the gentleman who fainted for too long, the child whose breath had thinned to silence, the mother nearly lost in Whitechapel. Yet none dared contradict the physician's calm assurance. Victoria's husband, Prince Albert, stood near the window, his expression thoughtful. He had read the medical debates, weighed the arguments, and now observed his wife with quiet concern. At last, he spoke. "If it eases your suffering, my dear, perhaps it is worth considering." The Queen lowered her eyes, fingers tracing the embroidered edge of her cushion. She remembered her previous confinements, the tearing pain, the exhaustion, the trembling prayers whispered between contractions. She remembered wishing, in some small, private corner of her heart, for anything that might mercifully dull the world for even a moment. "Yes," she said softly, "I will consider it." The decision, once made, spread across the empire with remarkable speed. Newspapers hinted at a revolution in childbirth. Midwives murmured about the implications. Clergymen debated whether the use of such vapors defied divine decree, citing Eve's curse and the necessity of suffering. But the public was captivated. If the monarch herself embraced this strange, sweet-smelling substance, then surely it must be safe, perhaps even noble. On the day of the Queen's confinement, the palace was tense with anticipation. Outside, carriages waited like restless shadows. Inside, lamps burned low as Dr. Snow prepared the cloth, a pristine square of linen, folded with clinical precision. The chloroform bottle gleamed beneath the lamplight, its contents shimmering with deceptive gentleness. When the moment came, Victoria inhaled slowly, cautiously. The vapor drifted over her like an unseen veil. Her eyes softened, her breath steadied. The sharp edge of her pain dulled, replaced by a dreamlike warmth that astonished her. "It is delightful," she murmured, voice faint but resolute. And with that single word, spoken by the monarch of the world's most powerful empire, Chloroform's fate was sealed. By nightfall, news of her experience spread beyond the palace gates, crossing London with the speed of rumour and the weight of royal endorsement. Mothers rejoiced, surgeons boasted. Apothecaries sold out their supplies by morning. The empire embraced chloroform not reluctantly, not cautiously, but with full Victorian confidence in progress and modernity. Yet beneath the triumph, beneath the polished floors of Buckingham Palace and the cheers outside its gates, one truth still lingered like a floral ghost. Chloroform had not changed. It was still the same sweet, silent force, capable of mercy, capable of harm. And now, with the Queen's blessing, it was everywhere. The frost gathered thickly along the inside of the apothecary's window pane, blurring the world beyond into pale shapes and wavering shadows. It was early winter, and Bishopsgate Street wore its chill like a damp shroud. Yet within the narrow shop of Mr. Lionel Finch, the air was warm from the steady glow of 2 brass lamps and the faint heat rising from the mortar and pestle he had worked since dawn. Bottles lined the shelves, amber, cobalt, clear, each holding its own little secret, but none unnerved him as much as the one he kept isolated behind frosted glass in a locked cabinet near the back. Chloroform. The word alone seemed to alter the air around him. Finch had once regarded it as a marvel, a triumph of chemistry, something that might elevate his humble trade into the realm of true science. But that was before the requests began to multiply, before the physicians purchased it with haunted eyes, before the constables arrived with soft-voiced inquiries about deaths too tidy, too clean, too quiet. Now he handled it as one handles a venomous creature, carefully, reverently, knowing that even the smallest mistake could carry a terrible cost. This morning, as the frost thickened outside, Finch stood at his counter reading a new letter from a colleague in Edinburgh. The handwriting trembled across the page. Several incidents now. The patients slip away without struggle. No convulsions, no warning, only stillness, soft as sleep. He swallowed hard. The lamplight trembled slightly as though reacting to his unease. The bell over the door chimed. A man entered, tall, with a coat buttoned high around his throat and a hat that cast a narrow shadow across his eyes. His boots left faint impressions on the floorboards, carrying traces of frost indoors. Finch straightened instinctively. "Good morning," the pharmacist said, forcing a polite smile. "How may I assist you?" The visitor removed his gloves with deliberate care. "I require chloroform," he said, his tone measured, almost too calm. 2 ounces, if you please." Finch's heart gave a small, uneasy flutter. 2 ounces was no minor purchase. It was a quantity suitable not for a demonstration, nor for a difficult tooth extraction, but for something more prolonged, more deliberate. "May I ask your profession, sir?" Finch ventured. The man paused, as if deciding whether truth or convenience would serve him better. "I assist a surgeon," he finally replied. "We have several procedures scheduled." The explanation was plausible, yet something in the man's gaze did not rest easily. Finch hesitated. He had seen this look before. Not always sinister, but often desperate. People sometimes came to him at the edge of despair, clutching coins with shaking hands, begging for relief not for themselves, but for those they feared to lose. But chloroform was not morphine, nor laudanum. It did not soothe the soul. It silenced it. "I must caution you," Finch said quietly. "It is potent. Even a slight excess may stop the breath entirely." The man's expression did not change. "I am aware." Too aware, Finch thought. Yet he could not refuse the sale. The law had not yet decided what chloroform was allowed to be. A miracle? A medicine? A threat? The apothecaries, caught between commerce and conscience, were left to navigate the uncertainty alone. Finch withdrew the key from his apron pocket. It rattled faintly as he turned it in the lock. The frosted glass door opened with a soft sigh. Inside, the rows of bottles gleamed like cold stars. He retrieved one carefully, as though lifting a sleeping infant. The liquid inside sloshed gently, sending its faint perfume into the air, a sweetness so subtle that it seemed to settle directly upon the nerves rather than the nostrils. As Finch measured the requested ounces, he felt the man's gaze upon him steady, probing, assessing. "Do you trust it?" the visitor asked suddenly. Finch nearly spilled a drop. "Trust it?" "Yes," the man said. "This substance, this miracle that ends pain." Finch swallowed. He thought of the letters, the warnings, the bodies carried out of hospital wards in perfect stillness. "No," he whispered at last. "I do not trust it. I respect it." The man nodded slowly, as though this were the answer he expected. He paid without haggling, tucked the bottle into his coat, and departed as quietly as he had come. When the door shut behind him, Finch released the breath he had been holding. Outside, the man's figure dissolved into the winter fog, swallowed whole by the city. Finch stood motionless for a long moment. Then he returned the key to his pocket, extinguished one of the lamps, and whispered to the empty room, "God help whoever breathes you in tonight." And from behind the frosted glass, the chloroform gleamed, silently waiting. The dentist's surgery on Fleet Street was a narrow, draughty place, wedged between a printmaker's shop and a tobacconist whose windows exhaled a perpetual haze of sweet smoke. Most days, the foot traffic outside drowned the sounds within whirring drills, clattering instruments, soft cries muffled behind closed doors. But on the morning of the tragedy, a peculiar hush settled over the street, as though London itself had paused to listen. Mrs. Eliza Turner arrived just after 9, clutching the thin hand of her 8-year-old son, Henry. The boy was pale, freckled, and visibly nervous, for a swelling in his jaw had tormented him through 2 sleepless nights. His mother, desperate to ease his misery, had agreed reluctantly to the dentist's newest offering, the painless modern method made possible by chloroform. Inside, the surgery smelled of soap, heated metal, and the faint ghost of past procedures. Instruments gleamed on a tray like miniature weapons polished for battle. The dentist, a stout, genial man named Mr. Rathbone, greeted them with reassuring warmth. He had used chloroform only 3 times before, but success had granted him a confidence that teetered on the edge of arrogance. "No need for worry," he told Mrs. Turner with a practiced smile. "He'll drift off as gently as if rocked to sleep. He shan't feel a thing." Henry climbed into the chair, his feet dangling above the floor. The dentist retrieved a folded cloth from a cabinet and uncorked a small bottle. The scent emerged at once sweet, faintly fruity, strangely comforting. Mrs. Turner stood nearby, twisting her gloves between anxious fingers. "Just breathe normally," Mr. Rathbone said, lowering the cloth over Henry's nose and mouth. At first, the boy tensed, startled by the unfamiliar fragrance, but then his small body softened, his eyelids fluttered, heavy as lead, his grip on the chair loosened. "That's it," the dentist murmured, pleased. "There we are." But the midwife's caution, the apothecary's trembling hands, the rumours seeping from hospital wards, none of these had reached Mr. Rathbone's ears in any meaningful way. He had not yet learned to sense the moment when relief shifted into danger. Henry's breaths slowed, then slowed again. Mrs. Turner leaned forward. "Is he all right?" "Yes, yes," the dentist replied too quickly. "Quite normal." But he faltered. The rise and fall of Henry's small chest grew shallow, so shallow that the lamp's flicker cast almost no shadow upon it. Mr. Rathbone removed the cloth abruptly, patting the boy's cheek with an urgency he tried to disguise. "Henry? There's a good lad. Wake now." The child did not stir. Mrs. Turner's gloves dropped to the floor. "Henry?" Her voice cracked. "Henry!" Panic took root. Mr. Rathbone lifted the boy's wrist, searching desperately for a pulse. His own hands trembled so fiercely that he could scarcely feel anything. "Fetch water," he shouted to his assistant. "Open the windows quickly." Cold air rushed into the cramped room. Mrs. Turner knelt beside the chair, stroking her son's forehead, her tears falling softly onto his still skin. "Please," she whispered, "please wake up." But Henry's breaths had faded to nothing quietly, peacefully, fatally. The chloroform had carried him too far, its sweetness concealing the line he had crossed. By the time the physician arrived from 2 streets over, it was far too late. Word of the child's death seeped through London with alarming speed. Some blamed the dentist's inexperience, others blamed the mother for allowing such a modern method. But among the medical community behind closed doors, beneath gas lamps burning low, the truth was spoken in fearful tones. Chloroform did not need violence to kill. It killed with gentleness, with silence, with the softness of a lullaby. The tragedy entered hospital ledgers under the tidy phrase, respiratory failure. But those who read between the lines understood the deeper warning. A warning wrapped in sweetness, drifting on perfumed vapor. A warning that more children would follow. For chloroform had only begun its quiet work in Victorian Britain. The ledger lay open on Dr. Percival Merrow's desk, its pages yellowed at the edges and faintly scented with dust and carbolic. Outside his office, the hospital hummed with its usual symphony of footsteps, murmured orders, and the clatter of instruments being sterilized. But within these 4 narrow walls, a stillness pressed against the air, an oppressive, breath-holding quiet broken only by the faint scratch of Merrow's pen. He had rewritten the line 6 times already. Patient expired due to unforeseen complication. Patient succumbed to weakness of the heart. Patient failed to recover from surgical shock. The words sat on the page like small, cowardly lies, thin veils, meant to conceal a truth as sharp and unforgiving as a scalpel. Yet each time he tried to write what he should, His hand trembled, the ink blotting into tiny pools that mirrored the panic rising in his chest. Chloroform. It was the silent cause of death. Again, he capped his pen and pressed his palms against his eyes. He could still see her, the young laundress who had arrived that morning, trembling from fever, her ankle grotesquely twisted after slipping on wet cobblestones. She had begged for relief during the procedure, begged not to feel the knife, and so, with the same confidence that had been drilled into him by lectures and medical journals, he had turned to the bottle. A miracle, his colleagues called it. Progress. A blessing from the modern age. But halfway through the operation, her breath had faltered. Her chest rose too slowly. Her lips blanched to an eerie blue. Mero had pulled the cloth away at once, too late. The stillness that settled over her was absolute, terribly peaceful, as though chloroform, with its perfumed allure, had merely persuaded her to drift a breath too far. Now she lay in the morgue downstairs beneath a thin white sheet, and he sat here sleepless, shaking, his career hanging between honesty and ruin. A soft tap sounded at the door. Nurse Havisham, her cap askew from hours of work, stepped inside. Her eyes tired, perceptive, settled on the untouched tea beside him, the rumpled papers, the ink-stained fingertips. "Doctor, the superintendent will need the report before evening rounds." "Yes." Mero forced steadiness into his voice. "I'm nearly finished." Her gaze flicked toward the ledger. She hesitated. "She was breathing well at first," the nurse said quietly. "I was watching her. And then, all at once, she wasn't." He swallowed. "I know. Perhaps," she continued cautiously, "the chloroform was too strong. Or perhaps," he thought bitterly, "we know too little." The nurse set a folded cloth on his desk, her own, still faintly scented with the sweetness that haunted him now. "You administered only 4 drops, she whispered. "I counted." Mero met her eyes. He saw fear there, not of him, but of the vapor that had claimed yet another life with such deceptive softness. "If we write the truth," he murmured, "it will call the entire practice into question. Every surgeon who has used the vapor will face scrutiny. The hospital will be blamed. The families will demand explanations we cannot yet give." Nurse Havisham looked down at her hands. "And if we don't write the truth?" That question filled the room like smoke. At last, Mero dipped his pen again. The nib trembled against the page. He exhaled slowly, as though steadying himself before a plunge. In careful, deliberate strokes he wrote, "Patient expired while under chloroform anesthesia, cause suspected cardiac and respiratory failure associated with vapor administration." When he finished, he felt no relief, only a profound and aching exhaustion. But his hand no longer shook. Nurse Havisham nodded once, solemnly. "It's time someone wrote it plainly." Mero closed the ledger, the soft thud sounding almost like a eulogy. Outside, the scent of chloroform drifted faintly from the theatre, a reminder that even as he documented its danger, others continued to trust it. He rose, shoulders heavy, and stared through the frosted glass of his office door at the shadows moving beyond. "God help us," he whispered. "We are wielding something we barely understand." And the vapor, sweet, silent, seductive, continued its quiet reign through the corridors of Victorian medicine, leaving behind more questions than answers, and far too many still bodies marked by nothing but the scent of wilted flowers. In the grand townhouse on Cavendish Square, where gilt-framed portraits stared down with cold aristocratic indifference, the servants moved like shadows, silent, obedient, invisible. None more so than Mary Whitcomb, the youngest housemaid, whose days were spent polishing banisters she never ascended and scrubbing floors she never walked upon for pleasure. Her world was narrow, woven from whispered orders, clattering pans, and the relentless ticking of a clock that never seemed to speed or slow. But Mary carried a secret now, one tucked deep within the pocket of her apron, a small glass bottle wrapped in cloth. its contents shimmering with perfumed danger. Chloroform. She had not meant to acquire it. Her path to possession was accidental, almost innocent. A week prior, she had been sent to fetch a parcel from the neighborhood apothecary, an errand she accepted eagerly, if only for the excuse to step into fresh air. But while the apothecary prepared her mistress's tonic, Mary's gaze drifted to the counter where a tiny vial sat unattended, its label written in elegant script. For medical use, administer with utmost caution. She had heard of chloroform from the newspapers left in the servants' hall. Stories of painless operations, stories of terrible accidents, and stories quietly murmured by kitchen girls of people who used just a drop or two to help themselves sleep through the night. Mary had not slept properly in months, not since the coughing began in the nursery, not since little Sophie, the child she tended, fell feverish and pale. Mary had sat beside the cradle night after night, wiping the child's brow, rocking her through bouts of shivering and fright. She had grown hollow-eyed with worry, her nerves stretched thin enough to tremble at the slightest sound. Sleep had become a luxury she could not afford, and so, when the apothecary turned his back, Mary slipped the small bottle into the folds of her apron, a decision born not from malice but desperation, yet still a theft, still a sin, still a risk that trembled in her hands. Now, each night, after extinguishing the lamps and settling the household into its quiet breathing, Mary retreated to her attic room beneath the eaves. The walls were thin, the floorboards cold, the moonlight sparse. She would sit on her narrow bed and hold the bottle up to the weak light, watching the liquid shimmer like pale honey. Just one drop, she told herself the first night. Only one. She dabbed the cloth lightly, pressed it to her nose, and inhaled. The effect was immediate, a warm drifting, a soft loosening of the knotted rope that tied her nerves in constant strain. She felt herself sinking into a calm so deep it frightened her, yet she did not resist. For the first time in weeks, her mind quieted, her breath evened, her muscles untensed. She slept, and in the morning she felt almost human again. But chloroform's mercy was a dangerous thing, sweet on the tongue, seductive to the weary, and far too willing to offer its embrace. One drop became two, two became three. Soon Mary found herself reaching for the bottle not only at night, but in the moments between her chores, just a small inhalation to steady her trembling hands, to push back the rising tide of worry and exhaustion. Her eyes began to lose their brightness. Her steps faltered on the stairs. She dropped plates. She forgot instructions. The housekeeper scolded her, suspecting laziness, never imagining the truth. One night, as rain pattered softly against the attic window, Mary uncorked the bottle once more. The vapor drifted upward like a pale ghost. She pressed the cloth to her face, sighing into the sweetness that seemed to promise peace. But tonight, her hands were shaking more than usual. Tonight, the drops pooled too quickly. Tonight, the cloth felt heavier, wetter, colder. She inhaled. The world tilted. Her lamp flickered. Her pulse slowed. The shadows around her bed stretched long and soft, folding in like arms around a sleeping child. And for the first time, Mary wondered, not in fear, but in the soft, drifting haze, whether she would wake at all. Downstairs, the house continued its quiet, aristocratic dreaming. Upstairs, behind the attic door no one thought to open, chloroform settled its final, perfumed kiss upon the air, and the housemaid, with the hidden bottle, slept on, far too deeply, far too silently, exactly as Victorian Britain was beginning to do. The Ashworths' parlour was the sort of room built for admiration rather than comfort. High ceilings glowed beneath a canopy of gas lamps, their light reflected in polished silver mirrors. Velvet drapes pooled like spilled wine along the floorboards, and the floral wallpaper, oversaturated with roses, seemed almost to pulse in the lamplight. The air smelled faintly of perfume, furniture wax, and the ever-present coal smoke drifting in from the street. It was here, on a Saturday evening in early autumn, that Mr. Leonard Ashworth decided to entertain his guests with the newest fascination of polite society, chloroform. His wife, Eleanor, had attempted to dissuade him. "Leonard, it is not a toy," she whispered urgently as she rearranged the tea tray. "I read only yesterday of a boy who—" "Nonsense," he interrupted with a dismissive flick of his hand. "That was due to incompetence. I shall give a proper demonstration, scientific, controlled." But Mr. Ashworth's concept of controlled was as fragile as the porcelain cups on the table. By 8 o'clock, the parlour had filled with elegantly dressed guests, ladies in shimmering silk, gentlemen in stiff collars, all eager to witness something novel. Rumour had already spread through London that Queen Victoria herself had used the vapour, lending the substance an air of royal legitimacy. Curiosity sparkled like champagne in every eye. On the sideboard, beside a silver biscuit tin, sat the small glass bottle. Its label read simply, "Chloroform for medical use." Under the lamplight, the liquid inside glimmered as though holding a secret. Mr. Ashworth tapped his spoon against a teacup, clearing his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, may I introduce to you the marvel of modern anesthesia?" A murmur rippled through the room. Eleanor felt a cold knot tighten beneath her ribs. He unfolded a linen handkerchief with theatrical flourish. "A few drops only," he assured the crowd. "Enough to calm the nerves and lull one into a gentle sleep." The guests leaned forward as he uncorked the bottle. The scent drifted out at once, soft, sweet, disturbingly pleasant. Someone sighed appreciatively. Another stifled a giggle. "For the demonstration," Mr. Ashworth continued, "my esteemed friend Mr. Collingwood has agreed to volunteer." Mr. Collingwood, a ruddy-faced man already flushed from brandy, stumbled good-naturedly to the centre of the room. "Happy to be of service," he declared, wobbling slightly. Eleanor's hand tightened around the back of a chair. "Leonard, please, enough now." But her husband ignored her. He held the cloth beneath the lamplight, adding drop after shimmering drop until the linen darkened with moisture. Mr. Collingwood inhaled eagerly. At first, he laughed a short, bewildered sound that melted into a sigh. His eyes half closed, his shoulders slumped. "Remarkable," someone whispered. "How peaceful he looks." But the peace shifted too quickly. His body grew still, too still. His laughter faded into quiet. His breath thinned, fluttering like a candle flame caught in a draught. Mr. Ashworth's smile faltered. "Collingwood, my dear fellow?" He waved a hand before the man's vacant gaze. "You may wake now." But Mr. Collingwood did not wake. His knees buckled. He crumpled forward onto the carpet with a sound terribly soft for something so catastrophic. Gasps erupted. A woman shrieked. The teacups rattled violently on their saucers as several guests surged toward him. Eleanor fell to her knees beside the unconscious man, her fingers trembling as she pressed them beneath his jawline. "Oh God," she whispered. Leonard, his pulse. "It's barely there." Panic bloomed like ink in water. Mr. Ashworth, suddenly ashen, snatched the cloth from the floor and flung it across the room as though it were venomous. "Open the windows!" he barked. "Bring water! Quickly!" But the windows jammed in their frames. The lamps flickered with a low hiss. The room filled with the faint, lingering sweetness of chloroform, the scent of a disaster unfolding beneath silk and candlelight. Mr. Collingwood's breaths became intermittent, fleeting, then frighteningly absent. Eleanor pressed her ear to his chest. Nothing. Just as dread closed its fist around the room, a faint, rasping gasp escaped his lips. Then another. Barely their breaths returned, fragile as threads. He lived, but only just. A torrent of frantic instructions followed. Chairs toppled. A servant fled for a physician. Ladies sobbed into lace gloves. And Mr. Ashworth, proud, confident Mr. Ashworth, stood shaking in the centre of his parlour, staring at the bottle as though it had betrayed him personally. When the physician arrived and Mr. Collingwood was carried away, the parlour lay in ruins, cups overturned, drapes disturbed, guests pale and silent. The bottle remained on the sideboard, catching the light so innocently that one might forget the danger it held. But Eleanor did not forget. As she wiped the handkerchief from the floor, she whispered to herself, "Sweetness should not smell like death." And in homes across Victorian Britain, similar parlour demonstrations continued, each one flirting with the same silent peril, each one adding another tremor to the growing fear that chloroform's promise of mercy came with a shadow far darker than society wished to admit. It began in drawing rooms, in the hush between courses at dinner parties, in the soft rustle of silk as ladies leaned closer to one another. Victorian London thrived on gossip, polished, perfumed, and sharpened just enough to wound without appearing cruel. But no topic stirred such nervous fascination, such tremulous delight, as chloroform. After the near tragedies whispered through the upper class, the substance did not lose its popularity. It changed shape. It became something fraught with danger and elegance. Something discussed in murmurs behind lace fans, like an illicit romance or a scandal involving a duchess. In the parlour of Lady Harrogate, whose curtains of pale pink silk framed the room like a stage, several women gathered for afternoon tea. Their gowns glimmered beneath the filtered daylight. The tea service steamed gently, and the air hummed with restrained curiosity. "I heard," said Mrs. Worthing, lowering her voice to a whisper, "that a gentleman on Fleet Street inhaled too deeply and nearly passed into eternity." "Oh, yes," murmured Lady Harrogate, her fingers toying with the fringe of her shawl. "And yet my cousin insists the Queen herself adored the relief during labour. If Her Majesty trusts it, how dangerous can it truly be? Dangerous enough to kill a grown man in less than a minute," thought Miss Eleanor Fairfax, who sat slightly apart from the group. Her cousin had been at Mr. Ashworth's doomed demonstration. She had heard the shrieks, seen the doctor pale as milk, but she held her tongue. In rooms such as these, truth was unwelcome unless it came clothed in charm. Another lady leaned forward, the pearls at her throat trembling with excitement. "My physician offered it to me during the extraction of a tooth. He swore I would feel absolutely nothing." "And did you accept?" Eleanor asked gently. A flutter of laughter moved around the room like startled birds. "Certainly not," the woman replied. "Imagine fainting in the presence of men. They see enough of us at our worst as it is." Yet even as she dismissed the idea, a shadow lingered in her eyes, curiosity laced with fear. Lady Harrogate poured another cup of tea, her hand trembling ever so slightly. "I cannot deny," she confessed, "that I am tempted to drift away from pain, to silence the body's torment." She exhaled softly. What a miracle it must feel like. Eleanor knew better. She had seen the aftermath of such drifting, the fragile breaths, the blue lips, the terror in a doctor's eyes when he realized how thin the line was between sleep and stillness. "Miracles often come with a price," she said. The room paused. Silk curtains swayed in a faint breeze, as if reacting to her words. Mrs. Worthing leaned in. "Do tell us, Miss Fairfax. You have the look of someone who knows more than she reveals." Eleanor hesitated, glancing toward the window where a carriage rolled past, its wheels hissing against damp cobblestones. For a moment she considered explaining the truth, the near death she had witnessed, the way chloroform's sweetness clung to the air long after the danger had passed. But instead she lifted her teacup, hiding her expression behind the rising steam. "I know," she said carefully, "that chloroform does not discriminate. It offers comfort with the same hand that delivers silence." A chill settled briefly over the room. Then Lady Harrogate laughed brightly, too loudly, as though banishing a ghost. "My dear, you sound like a novelist. Surely the doctors know what they are doing." Eleanor did not answer, because at that very moment In another household not far away, a surgeon's wife sat beside the still body of her husband, taken by the same vapor he had administered countless times. And somewhere in the East End, a thief soaked a cloth with the floral-scented liquid, preparing to make his next robbery effortless. The whispers behind the silk curtains were not mere gossip. They were the first tremors of a truth society was reluctant to confront. Beauty can mask a blade. Sweetness can hide a grave. And chloroform, so delicate, so tempting, so modern, had slipped into Victorian Britain wrapped in elegance, carrying a shadow that lengthened with every hushed conversation. The ladies continued their tea. The curtains swayed. And outside, London breathed in the same perilous sweetness, unaware of how deeply it would soon inhale. The bell above the door of Whitfield and Sons' funeral establishment chimed with an unsettling regularity that autumn so frequent, in fact, that Mr. Nathaniel Whitfield began to dread the sound. It meant another caller seeking quiet arrangements, another family stepping into his dim, lavender-scented showroom with hollow eyes and trembling hands. Business, by every measurable standard, was flourishing, yet prosperity had never tasted so bitter. The undertaker's shop was a narrow, solemn building tucked between a shuttered drapery and a pawnbroker. Its windows were frosted, not by winter's breath, but by deliberate design shielding delicate sensibilities from the polished coffins displayed within. Inside, the air carried the fragrance of lilies, beeswax polish, and something faintly chemical, a lingering ghost of disinfectant used to prepare the newly deceased. In earlier years, most of Whitfield's clients had succumbed to familiar foes: consumption, cholera, poor sanitation, misfortune. But lately, something different haunted London's death records. A new pattern, a peculiar stillness in the bodies brought to him. Faces peaceful, breath long faded, no struggle etched upon their features, as if they had drifted somewhere soft and far away, never to return. Chloroform. Whitfield had heard the word whispered at every funeral he attended. It fell from the lips of grieving parents, anxious doctors, and even clergymen who tried and failed to keep their voices free of fear. He did not pretend to understand the science of it, but he understood patterns, and this one was unmistakable. One fog-heavy morning, a coach stopped outside his shop, its wheels crunching through damp gravel. Two men descended, carrying between them the still form of a young seamstress wrapped in a thin blanket. Her mother followed close behind, her breath clouding in the cold air. Whitfield opened the door with practiced sympathy. "I am so sorry for your loss," he murmured, as they brought the body inside. The mother nodded, swallowing a sob. "It was the vapor," she whispered. "The doctor said she needed it just to spare her pain." Her voice cracked. "But it spared her everything." Whitfield guided her toward a chair, as his assistants gently lifted the girl onto the preparation table. The undertaker approached the body with habitual composure, yet something in her expression unsettled him. There was a softness to her features, a faint curve at the mouth that mimicked serenity, not the clenched teeth or furrowed brow of suffering, rather the quiet of someone who had simply slipped away. He had seen that same expression 3 times the previous week, and 7 times the week before. As he worked, smoothing the girl's hair and arranging her hands, the faintest scent reached him, floral, bruised, unmistakable. Chloroform clung to her even in death, as though marking her as one of its own. The undertaker paused, his breath catching. No other cause he prepared carried such a signature. Not consumption's sour sweetness, nor typhus's metallic odor. Only this one left behind a perfume as chilling as it was delicate. Later that afternoon, Reverend Pike arrived to speak with the mother. Whitfield overheard snippets of their conversation drifting from the small adjoining parlor. "God does not wish suffering on his children," the Reverend said gently. "But must it be this way?" the mother asked. One moment she breathed. The next, she did not. A silence followed. broken only by her trembling question. "How can mercy kill?" Whitfield felt the weight of those words settle on him like damp wool. When the funeral concluded 2 days later, he watched as the mourners dispersed into the fog, their grief trailing behind them like shadows. He returned inside, wiping rainwater from his sleeves, and found himself staring at his ledger, its pages filled with fresh entries written far too close together. Business was better than it had ever been, and London, increasingly, was falling asleep under a scented veil it did not yet fear. Whitfield closed the book softly. Prosperity, he realized, could arrive like chloroform, sweet, silent, and hiding a terrible truth beneath its gentle surface. And he feared the city had only begun to breathe it in. Fog rolled thickly through the alleys of Spitalfields, settling into the uneven cobblestones and curling around the dim glow of the gas lamps like a creature unwilling to sleep. Night in London belonged to many kinds of men, dock workers returning late, carriages racing toward Mayfair, drunkards singing off-key hymns to the moon. But it belonged most of all to thieves who moved through the shadows with quiet confidence, pockets waiting to be filled. Among these nocturnal figures was Silas Gray, a pickpocket of modest skill but exceptional cunning. He had survived on quick hands and quicker feet, yet lately the city had become more dangerous for his kind. Policemen patrolled the markets more vigilantly. Street vendors kept tighter watch over their purses. But Silas had recently acquired something new, something that made him feel untouchable. A small bottle of chloroform. It lay nestled inside his coat, its presence both comforting and unsettling. He had purchased it 2 weeks prior from an apothecary who never once lifted his gaze, as though unwilling to acknowledge the transaction. Silas understood immediately. Men with honest intentions did not buy chloroform in alley-thin quantities at closing time. He first tested it in an abandoned stable on the edge of Whitechapel. A few drops on a rag, a deep breath. The vapor drifted upward, soft and sweet, almost seductive. Silas's vision blurred. His knees buckled. He collapsed onto a pile of hay, blinking up at the ceiling beams that swayed like drunk acrobats. When he woke 2 hours later, head throbbing, he realized 2 things. The stuff worked, and it worked too well. But in the mind of a thief, such potency was not a warning. It was an opportunity. Tonight's target was a wealthy merchant known for carrying far too much cash on his evening walks home from the counting house. Silas followed him for several streets, keeping to the fog, the vapor bottle pressing cool against his ribs. The man's footsteps echoed steadily, confident yet oblivious, the stride of someone who believed brute wealth offered a kind of protection. They reached a narrow lane where the lamp's flame flickered weakly against the damp air. This was the moment. Silas quickened his pace until he was a mere breath behind the merchant. Then, in one swift motion, he pressed the chloroform-soaked cloth over the man's mouth and nose. At first the merchant stiffened, hands flying up in instinctive defense. Silas held firm, whispering, "Easy, now, easy." The struggle lasted only seconds. The merchant's eyes fluttered, his limbs growing heavy, slackening like a puppet, losing its strings. He collapsed against Silas, who dragged him gently to the side of the lane, propping him against a wall. The sickly sweet scent of chloroform lingered in the air, mingling with the smell of rain-soaked stone. Silas rifled through the man's pockets quickly, coins, a pocket watch, a ring whose gemstone glinted even in the weak lamplight. It was done. Clean. Quiet. No cries for help. No footsteps running away. Only the faint sound of the merchant's slow, uneasy breathing. And yet, as Silas straightened, a strange unease prickled his spine. The man's chest rose too shallowly. Too slowly. Silas crouched beside him again, hesitation breaking through his triumphant grin. "Come on," he muttered. "Wake up." But chloroform did not obey thieves. It obeyed physics, lungs, fate. The merchant remained slumped, motionless, his breath barely perceptible. Silas swore under his breath and fled, disappearing into the fog as swiftly as a shadow. By dawn, the merchant's body was discovered by a lamplighter. The cause of death was recorded as heart failure, though rumors spread quickly: a robbery, a mysterious scent upon the victim's clothes, a faint floral trace clinging to the air like a ghost that refused to leave. For days after, Silas could not shake the memory of that unmoving chest, that fragile breath fading beneath his hands. He reached for the bottle again and again, contemplating its power with a mixture of awe and dread. He had thought the vapor a perfect ally. He now understood it was a silent partner, one that demanded far more than thieves were prepared to pay. Still, he kept the bottle. Still, he used it. Because in Victorian London, danger wrapped in sweetness was not something to avoid. It was something to exploit. And chloroform, quiet, potent, obedient, only until it chose not to be, was becoming the newest weapon in the city's dark underbelly. Detective Sergeant Tobias Hensley had walked the streets of London for over 20 years, and in all that time he believed he understood the city. He knew the rhythm of the markets, the clatter of the carriages, the way fog settled into the corners of alleys like living things. But in the past fortnight, something new had begun to slip through his senses, a scent, subtle yet unmistakable, curling along the cobblestones and drifting through the gaslit streets like an invisible herald of misfortune. Chloroform. It had begun with rumours, as most London mischief did. Tales of gentlemen collapsing too deeply in Ashworth's drawing-room, reports whispered among the midwives of Whitechapel. And then, most alarmingly, bodies discovered in the quiet of bedrooms, their last breath, stolen by something sweet and perfumed. Hensley had learned quickly, this was not mere laudanum, nor the faint traces of ether once used by obstetricians. Chloroform was different. It carried an air of civility, of modernity, of trust, and yet beneath that veneer was a cold, unyielding efficiency that could kill without struggle or sound. That night, the fog pressed against the street lamps as Hensley followed the trace. He had begun to recognize it pale, floral, faintly bruised, and it pulled him along quieter paths, winding around narrow alleys and past shuttered windows. The scent was clever. It shifted with the breeze. It lingered just long enough to be noticed, then vanished as if it had never existed. Yet Hensley trusted his nose, as he had trusted it through countless investigations into burglary, assault, and murder. He rounded the corner of a small lane near the docks. The smell was stronger here, clinging to the damp stone walls. A figure moved ahead, hunched, cautious, clutching something to the chest beneath a thick coat. Hensley's pulse quickened. The thief, or murderer, was close. The scent was their companion, trailing from the small glass vial they carried like a talisman. Hensley slowed, following silently, footsteps muffled against the fog-slick stones. He observed the figure pause beside a lamplight, sniffing the air as though the vapor itself were a friend guiding him. The detective's mind raced through the cases he had reviewed: the child in Fleet Street, the man in the Ashworth parlour, the housemaid hidden in Whitechapel. Each incident bore the same mark: a faint, lingering perfume, a scent of sleep that did not promise waking. The figure knelt suddenly, pressing a cloth over a young man who had been leaning against the wall, exhausted from labour in the markets. Hensley's stomach twisted. He recognized the ritual. The faint whiff of chloroform hung thick, sweet, and dreadful. The victim's eyes fluttered. His body slackened. Hensley drew a deep, steadying breath. The detective had no weapon for this, nothing to restrain a vapor, nothing to halt the quiet thief who wielded it. Only observation, memory, and the urgent need to record every detail for the authorities. He noted the direction the figure moved, the careful way the cloth was handled, the almost ritualistic precision of its administration. Each action mirrored the reports he had studied, each move deliberate and chilling in its innocence. By the time the perpetrator disappeared into the night, Hensley was left with the scent alone, a ghost that lingered along the alley, filling his nostrils with the quiet menace of chloroform. He exhaled slowly, the fog mingling with his breath. London was sleeping under a new threat now, and it had no need for force or alarm. The streets themselves carried the perfume of death, and somewhere, behind the veil of mist, a silent hand moved freely, guided by the sweetest, deadliest of promises. Hensley straightened, pen and notebook in hand. He knew the city would soon learn what he already understood, that chloroform was not merely a medicine, nor merely a novelty. It was a power that demanded respect, a spectre trailing through the alleys, and those who followed its scent would either capture it or become its next victim. By the time the first frost settled over London, the ward at St. Bartholomew's had taken on a strange, unnatural quiet. The gas lamps flickered against the walls, casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to linger longer than they should. It was a ward like any other in the city. Narrow corridors, high ceilings, rows of iron-framed beds. But now, beneath the careful attentions of nurses and the clinical efficiency of physicians, it carried something different, a pervasive, intoxicating stillness. Chloroform had arrived in the hospital not as a rumor, not as a whisper, but as a presence. It was measured, applied, and administered with meticulous care. Patients were meant to benefit, to drift gently into unconsciousness while the surgeons performed their delicate work. And yet, over the weeks, the vapor revealed a side of itself far more potent than anyone had anticipated. Nurse Matilda Hargrove made her rounds, her boots muffled against the worn floorboards. She paused at bed number 7. A young labourer's wife lay there, her chest rising with a rhythm so slow that Matilda thought for a moment the woman might have stopped altogether. Her eyes fluttered beneath closed lids, lips parted faintly. The sweet scent of chloroform lingered around her, wafting into the corridor like a perfumed ghost. "Steady, now," Matilda murmured, brushing the damp hair from the woman's forehead. "Steady." The patient shifted slightly, still under the spell of the vapor, and Matilda moved to the next bed. Each one offered the same unnerving scene. Bodies slack, limbs unmoving, yet breaths still present on the edge of life, held hostage by the perfume that promised relief. The ward had become a chamber of suspended animation, a place where pain had been stolen, but at a cost that only the nurses seemed to sense. Dr. Alistair Pembroke entered silently, glancing at the row of patients as though he were inspecting fine instruments rather than living beings. He carried his notes in a leather folder, hand trembling slightly despite years of experience. Each morning, he recorded vital signs with painstaking care, knowing that even the most minute miscalculation could tip the balance between life and death. And every morning, he witnessed the same eerie tableau: men, women, and children rendered motionless by the very medicine meant to ease them. "The effect is remarkable," he said quietly to Nurse Hargrove, his voice barely rising above the faint hum of the lamps. "So complete, so thorough, no pain, no agitation." Matilda did not reply immediately. She had learned to measure her words carefully. "It is complete, sir," she said at last. "But I fear it is too thorough, too quiet." Pembroke's eyes narrowed. He understood her meaning. The line between unconsciousness and permanent stillness was fragile, blurred further each time the cloth was pressed lightly against a patient's nose. A drop too many, an inhalation too long, and the ward might no longer hold souls, only empty forms. Yet the hospital, in its blind devotion to progress, continued to use the vapor. Surgeons, nurses, and assistants followed the established protocol, praising the marvel of modern anesthesia even as a subtle dread grew in their hearts. They whispered among themselves during breaks, sharing stories of fainting patients, of unexpected respiratory failures, of the odd blue hue that sometimes touched the lips of those sleeping under the vapor's influence. Outside, London moved on oblivious. Carriages rattled through the frost, children played with thin scarves over their faces, and the fog wrapped the city in a cold, soft embrace. Inside the ward, however, time seemed to slow. It was a place where night merged with day, where the breathing of patients rose and fell in a strange, hypnotic rhythm, and where the scent of chloroform lingered like a promise sweet, dangerous, irresistible. By evening, the ward had become a cathedral of quiet, each bed a pulpit, each patient a silent testament to the miracle that had carried them into suspended rest. And Nurse Matilda, walking between them, could feel it in her bones. The ward had never truly slept, but it had become something far stranger, a place where life and stillness danced together under the shadow of the vapour that refused to be tamed. For London, and indeed for all of Victorian Britain, the ward was a glimpse of what chloroform could do: to soothe, to subdue, and, if misused, to claim entirely. Nurse Clara Montrose had been trained to endure the horrors of hospital wards. She had seen the toll of fever, the relentless gnaw of consumption, the pallor of typhus sweeping through rows of beds like a merciless tide. She had learned to steel her nerves against the cries of the dying, against the sudden, wet coughs that echoed in dimly lit corridors. Yet nothing had prepared her for the first time she smelled chloroform. It arrived quietly at St. Bartholomew's, like a perfumed visitor who had overstayed its welcome. The scent curled through the hallways, thin and subtle at first, a gentle presence in the air. But even in its faintness, Clara felt its power. She recognized immediately the same sweetness that had been mentioned in whispers outside London. Sweet as roses left too long in winter, cool and beguiling, carrying a quiet promise that made the flesh relax, even as it warmed the mind. The first patient she tended under the vapour was a child of no more than 7, small and feverish, cheeks flushed beneath pale brown hair. Dr. Pembroke, his manner confident and assured, had insisted that she hold the cloth in place while he observed the effects. Clara's fingers had trembled against the thin linen. The child's breath softened, slowed, and Clara understood too clearly that chloroform was a marvel, yes, but also a hazard. One inhalation too long, one drop too heavy, and the difference between life and death vanished entirely. She made a decision then and there. She would not breathe it in herself. She would not let the vapours curl around her lungs as they did around the patient's. Her colleagues were astonished. They had become used to administering chloroform as though it were a harmless perfume, inhaling just enough to steady their hands, to reassure themselves that they could trust what they dispensed. Clara would not. She refused. She would remain vigilant, untouched by its seductive quiet, to witness the danger with unclouded senses. And witness she did. Night after night, she moved among the beds, the faint, sweet scent of chloroform a constant companion. She observed the children drifting into dreamless slumber, the labouring women relaxing beneath its influence, the men succumbing to dental procedures without a murmur. But she also noted the irregular breaths, the pallor creeping beneath flushed skin, the pulse faltering at the edge of measurement. Each anomaly filled her with a quiet dread. One evening, as gas lamps flickered against the walls, Clara entered a ward where a young seamstress had been administered the vapour for a minor procedure. The child's chest rose and fell in a rhythm that was too shallow, her eyelashes brushing against pale cheeks. Clara's heart thumped against her ribs. She stepped closer, careful not to inhale even a trace of the sweet, fragrant fog lingering in the air. "Steady," she murmured, pressing her hand lightly against the girl's shoulder. Her mind raced through the lessons she had learned from whispers, from letters, from half-forgotten accounts of accidental deaths. The air smelled of roses, cold petals, and danger. She counted the seconds, monitoring the rise and fall of each breath as though her life depended on it, which, in a sense, it did. Dr. Pembroke entered moments later, nodding approvingly at the child's stillness. "The vapor works as intended," he said softly, unaware of Clara's tension. He did not smell what she smelled, did not see what she saw. To him, chloroform was a marvel, a tool of modern medicine. To Clara, it was both marvel and menace, beauty and predator. As she continued her rounds, moving from bed to bed without once inhaling, Clara understood something chilling and profound. Chloroform did not merely ease pain, it demanded vigilance, it required respect, and even in the hands of the careful, it carried a quiet, seductive threat that could claim breath, life, and silence, all beneath the softest, most perfumed veil. That night, as she removed her apron and extinguished the lamps, Clara Montrose whispered a prayer that the ward would remain awake in spirit even as the patient slept. For she alone had refused the vapor's embrace, and in doing so had glimpsed the shadow beneath its sweetness. The grand chamber at Grosvenor House had been prepared with painstaking care. Candles burned low, casting trembling light across satin sheets and gilded furniture. The air smelled faintly of rosewater and wax polish, mixed with the cool bite of winter air creeping through the narrow windowpanes. Outside, London slept under a blanket of fog, its streets muffled, silent. Inside, anticipation hung thick as the heavy velvet drapes. Miss Beatrice Langley had been married just that afternoon to a gentleman of impeccable pedigree, the son of a well-respected banker. The ceremony had been flawless. The guests, suitably impressed, had departed, leaving the chamber in the care of the newlyweds and their attendants. Yet Beatrice could not forget the subtle unease that had shadowed the day, the hurried whispers among the servants, the faintly perfumed aroma that seemed to linger in corners, almost deliberately, unseen. Her new husband, Mr. Thomas Harrington, had recently taken an interest in chloroform. He had read of its wonders, the ability to quiet pain and temper distress, and it had become a peculiar fascination. That fascination, innocent in his mind, carried an undercurrent of control that Beatrice would come to sense with unnerving clarity. "Do not worry," he said softly, producing a small, glass-stoppered bottle from the folds of his dressing gown. Its contents shimmered like distilled moonlight. "It will make the evening easier. Comfortable." Beatrice's fingers froze. She had heard of chloroform, of the tales whispered behind lace curtains, of gentlemen who had inhaled too deeply, of children who had been lulled into unrecoverable sleep. She tried to speak, to refuse, but Thomas's eyes held the quiet certainty of a man convinced of his wisdom. "It is merely a few drops," he insisted, unfolding a small handkerchief. "For relief, nothing more." The first inhalation was subtle, almost tender. The perfume of the vapor curled gently about her senses, soft as the petals of the roses that had adorned the wedding bouquet. A warmth seeped into her body, a curious weightlessness that was as terrifying as it was enticing. She tried to resist, tried to pull away, but her limbs betrayed her, softening beneath the invisible embrace of the vapor. "Relax, my dear," Thomas murmured. His voice was gentle, soothing, a lie dressed in silk tones. "You will feel nothing." And she felt nothing. The room seemed to tilt. The candles flickered unnaturally, shadows stretching long across the walls. Beatrice's heart pounded faintly, a ghostly echo beneath the soft thrum of the vapor in her lungs. Her consciousness wavered, drawn toward a dreamlike state that promised peace but whispered peril. Thomas watched her with a calm satisfaction, his hands steady as he held the handkerchief in place. To him, the experiment was successful. To her, it was horrifying. Each breath under the sweet-smelling cloth carried her further from herself. Each inhalation, a theft of agency, of breath, of life. The seconds stretched endlessly. Outside the window, fog pressed against the glass. A carriage rolled past, muffled wheels on wet cobblestones, distant voices lost to the vapor-laden night. Inside, the room had become suspended time itself, held in quiet suspension by the delicate, deadly perfume. Beatrice's senses began to dim. The faint scent of roses and wax, the flicker of candlelight, the soft padding of her husband's steps, all became distant, unreal. A terror crept along the edges of her mind. What if she did not awaken? What if the sweet relief promised by the gentleman she had just married became the silence that claimed her entirely? Thomas, confident and untroubled, continued his ministrations, unaware of the dread gathering in her soul. And then, as though responding to some fragile plea, she drew a shuddering, uneven breath, her eyes fluttering open just enough to remind her that she still existed. The handkerchief was removed. The room returned to its ordinary dimensions. The shadows receded. The candles burned with a gentle glow. And Beatrice, trembling beneath the lingering perfume, realized the truth. The night would never feel innocent again. Chloroform had entered her life not as a medicine, nor as relief, but as a quiet, seductive predator, cloaked in elegance, hidden beneath the veil of perfumed sweetness. London, as ever, remained unaware. But in the quiet of Grosvenor House, one newlywed understood that the most intimate moments could be stolen without a sound, and that the vapour which promised ease could just as easily promise oblivion. In the oak-panelled halls of Westminster, where sunlight strained through tall, grimy windows, and the scent of ink and damp parchment hung like a second skin, a report waited quietly to be read. It was small in form but vast in implication, a ledger of incidents, a tally of accidents, a whisper of death penned in careful, formal script. Its subject was chloroform, the sweet-scented vapour that had captivated surgeons, aristocrats, and midwives alike, and which had begun to leave its mark upon London with an almost imperceptible hand. The report had been prepared by a committee of physicians convened hastily after a string of troubling occurrences. Each case was detailed in muted language. Unforeseen complication, respiratory failure, patient did not recover from anesthesia. Behind the euphemisms lay the grim truth. Lives had been claimed silently, gently, by a substance praised for its mercy. Parliamentarians leaned over the heavy desk, quill pens poised, attempting to grasp the significance without allowing themselves to be swept into panic. They were men accustomed to debate over trade, taxation, and empire, yet here was a force they could neither see nor touch, a peril that invaded hospitals and drawing rooms alike, leaving only the soft, lingering scent of roses and wilted petals. Their expressions were polite, restrained, yet their eyes betrayed unease. One member, Sir Henry Aldridge, read aloud a passage describing a child in Fleet Street who had not awoken after a dental procedure. Respiratory cessation, he repeated carefully, as if speaking too loudly might summon the very danger in question. Murmurs of assent, or perhaps disbelief, rippled around the chamber. The gentlemen were uncertain how to weigh the gravity of an invisible, perfumed killer against the promises of scientific progress. Dr. William Percival, summoned to clarify, stood with a measured calm that belied the urgency he felt. He had seen the effects of chloroform firsthand, the pallor of lips, the thinning of breath, the eerie stillness that could settle over a patient in moments. "It is not merely the misapplication of technique," he said softly, voice echoing slightly in the chamber's lofty ceiling. "Chloroform carries with it a narrow margin between relief and calamity. Even careful administration has led to fatalities. The vapour does not yield to the best intentions alone." The members leaned closer, some fidgeting with rings or quills, others pressing hands to the carved arms of their chairs. A draught stirred the room, lifting the edges of the pages, as though the report itself were attempting to whisper its secrets into the ears of those who might act. Yet the response was measured. "We must not alarm the public," one member said, tapping his cane on the floor. "Chloroform represents advancement, not malice. To disclose every incident would invite hysteria. Progress cannot bend to fear." The report was set aside, filed among countless others, its truths buried beneath layers of procedure and prudence. Those who had lived within the wards and parlours, the nurses who refused to breathe it in, the housemaids who hid bottles, the surgeons whose hands trembled, understood what was at stake. But in the grand chambers of Parliament, the subtle danger was softened, diluted, sanitized with the same care that had been used to describe the deaths themselves. And so the report remained. Its margins bore the annotations of careful reading. Its words were faintly perfumed with the memory of hospitals and drawing rooms. But its message, silent, precise, chilling, was nearly lost beneath the weight of empire and etiquette. Outside, London slept. Fog pressed against the windows. Gas lamps flickered. Somewhere, a child dreamed under the influence of a cloth soaked in sweet liquid. Somewhere, a gentleman inhaled a few drops, unaware that the line between relief and oblivion was thinner than silk. And somewhere, chloroform waited gentle, perfumed, unstoppable. In Westminster, the officials returned to debates of commerce and politics, leaving the danger of the vapour to those who would witness its quiet, merciless work firsthand. In a narrow operating theatre at St. Mary's Hospital, where walls were painted a sterile white and iron instruments gleamed under the flicker of gas lamps, Dr. Frederick Langley prepared for another procedure. The room smelled faintly of carbolic, warmed linseed oil, and the subtle, unmistakable sweetness of chloroform. Every object had its place. The scalpel balanced precisely on a folded linen, the tray of forceps polished to a reflective shine, the small, glass-stoppered bottle at the edge of the table. Its contents glimmered softly in the lamplight, a promise of comfort and a shadow of peril. Langley had been administering chloroform for nearly a year, each procedure teaching him both awe and trepidation. He had learned to respect the vapour with the vigilance of a man walking a rope suspended over darkness. One drop too many, one inhalation too long, and the patient's breath could falter entirely. Tonight, he would administer it to a young woman suffering from a fractured wrist, a simple case by all accounts, yet he approached it with the same meticulous care he applied to the most complicated operations. He held the cloth between gloved fingers, folding it into a precise rectangle, aware that even the slightest misalignment could alter the flow of the vapour. The patient, seated upright, trembled beneath the blanket, eyes wide and glistening. Langley offered a reassuring smile, though he knew the veneer of calm could not reach the tremor in her limbs, the rapid beat of her heart. "Just breathe normally," he instructed softly, placing the cloth lightly over her face. Immediately, the faint scent rose, curling delicately into the corners of the room like a mischievous spirit. Sweet, floral, deceptively gentle. The patient's body began to soften, her fingers loosening around the edges of the chair. Langley watched, hand poised above the tray, eyes fixed. Seconds became his currency. 1, 2, 3, each measured silently, each tick of the clock marking the fragile balance between safety and calamity. He counted deliberately, whispering the seconds in his mind, as though the act of naming them could tether the vapour's power to his will. He observed the patient's chest, the gentle rise and fall, the subtle flutter of her eyelids. Her breathing slowed, yet remained steady. Relief mingled with a creeping dread. He had seen the vapour claim life as effortlessly as it soothed pain. Every inhalation carried duality, mercy and menace, entwined in the sweet perfume that now hovered in the room. Minutes passed. Langley's focus sharpened. One twitch of a finger, one falter of breath, 1 minute miscounted, and disaster could arrive silently. He adjusted the cloth with the gentlest touch, ensuring that the flow remained just enough to dull sensation, but not enough to steal life. The patient's pulse, faint beneath his fingertips, became a metronome for his vigilance. Around him, the ward lay in hushed anticipation. Nurses, trained and competent, waited for subtle signals, their hands hovering above instruments, eyes flicking between patient and surgeon. Langley's counting had become ritual, a necessary discipline. Seconds were not merely units of time, they were lifelines, delicate threads connecting a fragile human body to the safety he promised. Finally, the patient's muscles relaxed fully, but her breathing remained regular, shallow but unbroken. Langley gave a barely perceptible nod to his assistant. The scalpel touched the skin, and the procedure commenced. The young woman did not cry, did not flinch, did not awaken until the final stitch was placed. Langley exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing just enough for him to feel the faint pulse of satisfaction. Yet he did not lower his guard entirely. In every procedure, in every inhalation, he knew the truth that Victorian Britain was only beginning to understand. Chloroform was mercy's most beautiful disguise and death's quietest hand. As he set the cloth aside, Langley's gaze lingered on the bottle, glimmering innocently in the lamplight. Sweet, perfumed, irresistible, a friend to the surgeon who counted the seconds, and a spectre that would never stop claiming vigilance from those who dared to wield it. The Royal Theatre on Drury Lane had never felt so still. Even before the first gas lamps flickered to life, the air hung thick with anticipation. Patrons whispered politely in their stalls, the faint rustle of silk gowns and the soft shuffle of polished boots echoing in the cavernous space. On the stage, a demonstration was to take place. One promised to reveal the marvels of modern medicine to the city's most influential citizens. Chloroform, the newest wonder, was to be shown in the hands of a capable surgeon. The audience, a mixture of curious aristocrats, doctors, and gentlemen adventurers, leaned forward, eager to witness the promise of painless anesthesia. Dr. Edward Faraday, a man of precise habits and growing renown, stood at center stage, the theatre lights illuminating his composed figure. On the table before him lay a cloth and a small glass vial, its contents catching the lamplight like a miniature pool of liquid moonlight. The room was filled with a subtle fragrance, the faint, sweet scent of chloroform, perfumed and unsettling. Even the ushers and stagehands paused in their work to inhale the delicate aroma, drawn by its peculiar allure. A volunteer had been selected from the audience, a young man of sturdy build and agreeable temperament, eager to play a part in the advancement of science. He stepped forward, pale under the theatre's warm glow, and offered his wrist to the surgeon. Applause rippled through the crowd, polite and tentative, mingled with the occasional nervous murmur. Chloroform, they understood, was safe in theory. A miracle, a marvel of modern chemistry. Dr. Faraday dipped the cloth lightly into the bottle, exhaling a slow breath as he lifted it toward the volunteer's face. The first inhalation was subtle. The young man's eyes widened at the unusual sweetness, the soft floral note curling through his nostrils like smoke from distant gardens. He inhaled again, deeper this time, his shoulders relaxing, his hands loosening from their tight clasp. A gentle sigh escaped him, almost imperceptible, but enough to signal to the attentive surgeon that the vapor was taking hold. At first, the audience murmured in admiration. A few leaned forward, their curiosity sharpened by the novelty. One gentleman whispered, "Remarkable. He sleeps as if on a bed of clouds." Another nodded, his monocle glinting. The theatre seemed suspended, time itself caught in the delicate balance of science and sensation. But then the stillness deepened, too deep. The soft rise and fall of the volunteer's chest slowed, imperceptibly at first, then with increasing irregularity. A nurse seated at the side stage tensed, her hands instinctively moving toward the man. Dr. Faraday, though experienced, felt a pang of unease. The vapor was working with more potency than anticipated, its sweetness masking a lethargy that bordered on peril. The audience, initially charmed, grew quiet. Eyes shifted from the stage to one another, whispers vanishing entirely. A chill passed through the theatre, as if the scent itself had carried the warning too late. The young man's breathing thinned, becoming a faint, fragile thread. Dr. Faraday removed the cloth abruptly, pressing gently against the volunteer's chest, counting each heartbeat with meticulous attention. The silence of the room became oppressive, thick as velvet. Minutes passed, though they felt eternal. The young man stirred, eyes fluttering open to the soft gaslight and the anxious gaze of the surgeon. A faint murmur of relief moved through the audience, but the spell of suspense lingered. No applause followed, no laughter. The theatre remained unusually quiet, as if it had inhaled the vapor itself and was holding its breath in solidarity with the volunteers, the spectators, and the unseen hand of danger. Dr. Faraday replaced the bottle behind his small case, still glimmering innocently in the lamplight. He exhaled slowly, acutely aware that the demonstration had been a near disaster. Chloroform, he thought, was not merely a marvel, it was a silent arbiter of life and stillness, capable of enchanting a theatre full of men and women, leaving it suspended between admiration and dread. And as the audience filed from the hall, whispers spreading through London like mist, one thought settled in the minds of all present. In its sweetness, chloroform had power not merely to soothe, but to command attention and, if misused, to claim breath, silence, and the quiet awe of an entire theatre. The morning fog pressed thickly against the windows of St. Bartholomew's mortuary, curling around the wrought-iron grates and slipping through the narrow cracks of the sash. Inside, the air smelled of disinfectant, damp stone, and the faintly sweet undertone that clung to every patient who had ever inhaled chloroform. It was a fragrance subtle enough to be dismissed, yet unmistakably present an invisible witness to the events that had occurred, a ghost lingering among the tables and instruments. Dr. Ambrose Thayer stood over the slab, his hands gloved and still, his spectacles catching the dim lamplight. Before him lay the body of a young seamstress who had been admitted the previous evening with a minor laceration on her wrist. What should have been a routine procedure, she had inhaled the perfumed vapor and slipped too deeply into unconsciousness. By the time she was discovered, she had stopped breathing altogether. Yet here she was, lying in serene repose, as if she had merely drifted into a dream that would never end. Thayer had performed countless autopsies, each a meticulous study of flesh and organ, each revealing the secrets of disease, neglect, or accident. But chloroform left behind no obvious mark. There was no contusion, no hemorrhage, no visible trauma. The heart, lungs, and brain appeared ordinary, as though life had simply been erased in the absence of struggle. He pried open the eyelids, examined the tongue, checked the pulse of even the stillest capillaries. Nothing revealed the truth of what had stolen her breath, her warmth, her existence. He sighed, adjusting his spectacles. The mortuary was silent except for the faint drip of water from the tap and the occasional rustle of a student shifting nervously beside him. The apprentices had been instructed to observe, to learn, yet their expressions betrayed unease. They had never seen the vapor at work firsthand, had never smelled its delicate sweetness, and they could not reconcile the absence of evidence with the certainty of death. Dr. Thayer moved methodically, recording his observations in the ledger. Each word felt inadequate, a polite fiction that masked the invisible force responsible. Cause of death, undetermined, possible complications of anesthesia. The phrasing was intentionally vague, shielding both the living and the institutions that endorsed chloroform's use. Yet he knew, with a cold clarity, what had happened. The vapor, gentle, perfumed, and unyielding, had stolen life in a manner that left no trace. Outside the mortuary, the streets of London were beginning to stir. Carriages rattled over wet cobblestones. Shopkeepers opened their shutters, unaware of the quiet, deadly miracle that had claimed another citizen while the city slept. Thayer glanced once more at the body, noting the soft pallor of the skin, the faint curve of a mouth relaxed in dreamless repose. It was peaceful, yes, but it was also a warning. A student dared to speak. "Doctor, how can one prove it? How can anyone hold the vapor accountable?" Tyre's lips pressed into a thin line. "One cannot. Not truly. It leaves nothing but its scent behind a whisper in the air, a memory in the mind, and the empty weight of absence on a table." His voice, though quiet, seemed to echo through the stone chamber, mingling with the lingering perfume of chloroform, heavy as a spectre. He closed the ledger, the faint rustle of paper sounding almost like a sigh. Another death would follow, and another, and the hospitals would continue their work. The vapors still drifting, still subtle, still seductive. Chloroform, in its quiet brilliance, had mastered the art of leaving nothing to see, nothing to prove, nothing but its sweet, suffocating presence. And as Dr. Thayer removed his gloves and stepped into the cold fog of morning, he understood fully that this was the danger of progress. The more miraculous the tool, the easier it was to conceal its power, until one day the city itself would wake beneath a shadow it had never known. It was a quiet Tuesday morning at St. Giles Hospital, though in the operating theatre, the air was charged with anticipation. Dr. Henry Caldwell, a man esteemed for both his steady hands and meticulous nature, prepared for what should have been a simple extraction, a molar stubbornly lodged in the jaw of a young clerk. The patient, pale and trembling, sat upright, trying to mask his fear with polite stoicism. Around them, nurses and apprentices moved with the rehearsed efficiency of men and women, accustomed to the rhythm of procedure. Yet the sweet, floral scent of chloroform already lingered, curling softly along the stone walls. Caldwell had performed hundreds of operations under the vapor, and he counted himself among the careful ones. He prided himself on precision, on the subtle adjustments of dosage that allowed his patients to drift into dreamless oblivion without peril. Yet on this day, a peculiar fatigue weighed upon him, a subtle distraction from the pressing of cloth to nose and mouth, from the steady monitoring of pulse and respiration. He did not notice the slight hesitation in his hand as he administered the drops. 1, 2, 3, 10. The last fell a fraction too heavily upon the linen. The vapor swirled upward, denser than intended, wrapping the young clerk in a perfumed cloud that seemed almost sentient. His eyes widened, his chest lifted with a shallow, panicked breath, and then he softened, slackening entirely, as if gravity itself had claimed him prematurely. Caldwell's eyes went wide. He recognized instantly the peril he had invited. "Steady," he whispered to himself, though his own voice quavered. The assistant nurse's hand hovered above the patient, ready to assist, yet unsure how to counteract the invisible tide that had taken hold. The apprentices, pale and trembling, stood rigid, watching the sudden transformation. A living man rendered exquisitely still by a substance that had promised only relief. The seconds stretched into eternity. Caldwell bent over the young clerk, checking pulse and respiration with meticulous urgency. The breaths were there, yes, but thin, shallow, imperceptible unless one leaned close. The patient's lips were a fragile pink, fading subtly into a ghastly pallor that threatened to cross into the unseeable. Caldwell's hands shook against his gloves, and he realized with chilling clarity that he was confronting the razor's edge, upon which life balanced under chloroform. He removed the cloth hastily, the vapor curling into the corners of the theatre, and mingling with the scent of disinfectant and heated linseed oil. The young clerk shuddered, a faint, almost inaudible sound escaping from him. Then, gradually, he inhaled more deliberately, drawing back from the edge of oblivion. His body relaxed in the correct rhythm, his eyes fluttering open to meet Caldwell's urgent gaze. A faint sigh of relief passed through the room, yet it carried no triumph. Caldwell understood, with the stark clarity of experience, that the vapor was both servant and predator. One drop more than the precise measure could command life itself. 10 drops too many, and he might have lost his patient entirely. The incident would be quietly noted in the hospital log, phrased in careful, measured language. Patient experienced deeper than intended anesthesia. Procedure completed without incident. Outside observers, unaware of the near catastrophe, would marvel at the modern miracle. No one would know of the narrow margin, the 10 drops that almost stole life. Caldwell stood back, breathing slowly, hands pressed to his temples. He stared at the small glass bottle on the side table, its contents calm and glimmering under the lamplight. Sweet, enticing, deceptively benign. He understood then, as he had never truly understood before, the quiet terror of chloroform, a substance so delicate, so perfumed, so entrancing, and yet capable of taking more than relief. 10 drops too many, and death was a breath away. Outside, London moved on, ignorant of the razor edge upon which its citizens had danced. Inside the theatre, only the scent remained soft, floral, and infinitely dangerous. The fog lay heavy over Whitechapel that evening, pressing into the narrow alleys like a living thing. In one dimly lit parlour, a widow sat alone, her hands clasped around a teacup that had long since gone cold. Mrs. Amelia Garrow had once believed in the miracles of modern medicine, in the gentle, perfumed promises of chloroform, but that faith had been shattered, leaving her with nothing but grief, quiet rage, and the lingering sweetness of a vapour she could never forget. It had been 3 weeks since her husband, a humble clerk, had been admitted for a minor surgical procedure, a simple removal of a cyst from his forearm. The surgeon had assured her that chloroform would spare him pain, ease his suffering, and allow him to awaken refreshed and unharmed. Amelia, trusting the authority of the physicians and the miracles they promised, had left her husband in their care, returning to her home with the faint hope that modern science would grant her relief from witnessing his anguish. She had waited hours, and then the knock at her door came. A messenger, pale and hesitant, handed her a note. Her husband had not survived the procedure. The explanation was concise, clinical, mercifully polite. Patient expired due to unforeseen complications of anesthesia. No further details, no acknowledgement of the vapour that had stolen him, no hint of the subtle danger she had glimpsed in whispers through the corridors of the hospital. Amelia had clenched the note until her knuckles whitened, feeling the paper cut into her palm like a bitter truth. She had asked questions, demanded explanations, and had been met with the same carefully chosen words. Unforeseen complications, an unfortunate accident, a rare event. Yet she knew. She had smelled it herself, the delicate sweetness that lingered even in the corners of the ward, clinging to the sheets, the instruments, the very air her husband had breathed. That scent had carried him away, soft and silent, and now it haunted her, a ghost in every perfumed breeze that drifted through her home. Night after night, she would sit in the parlour, staring into the candlelight, imagining the vapour curling around his face, guiding him into stillness with a mercy that was merciless. She blamed the doctors, yes, but her anger was broader, directed at the substance itself, the beautiful, insidious chloroform that had promised relief and delivered only absence. She recounted the memory aloud to no one, the way his chest had slowed, the way his fingers had slackened in the grip of the cloth, the faint exhalation that marked the edge of consciousness before vanishing entirely. Each detail carved into her mind, sharper than any scalpel, more persistent than grief itself. Neighbours whispered in passing, noting the thin, drawn lines of her face, the quiet despair that seemed to cling to her like a shawl, but none understood. None had witnessed the delicate thief that had taken her husband, the vapour that moved silently, with elegance and with deadly precision. She had tried to avoid it, tried to keep the memory at bay, but chloroform had a way of lingering. In kitchens, in parlour rooms, in the faintly sweet traces of perfumed linens and polished floors, it haunted the city as it haunted her mind. Each breath she took seemed a reminder of the life stolen from her, each faint fragrance a reproach. And so Amelia Garrow lived with the blame, directing it not only at the men in white coats, but at the invisible hand that had guided them. The vapor was patient, perfumed, and unyielding. It had carried her husband to the quietest sleep imaginable. And in her mourning, she vowed never to forgive the substance that promised mercy, but delivered only absence, leaving a widow to count her grief in the empty spaces where life had once been. The nursery at Pembroke House was warm with the faint scent of lavender and boiled linens, a comforting contrast to the damp chill that clung to the streets of London. The infant lay swaddled in soft cotton, tiny fingers curled against her chest, eyes closed beneath long, delicate lashes. Her mother, Lady Eleanor Pembroke, watched with a mixture of awe and apprehension as Dr. Lionel Fairchild prepared the cloth, a small square of linen dampened with chloroform, its surface glimmering faintly beneath the flicker of a nearby lamp. It was meant to be a mercy, nothing more. The child had been restless through the night, her cries cutting sharply through the silence of the house, tearing at the nerves of all who tended her. Lady Eleanor had pleaded with the physician for some means to ease the infant's suffering, and he had offered chloroform with the same assurance he gave to patients of every age. A brief inhalation, a gentle, dreamless sleep, a momentary reprieve. Yet even as he spoke, Lady Eleanor felt a shiver of unease. The vapor, soft, perfumed, almost floral, wafted toward her in the still air, curling delicately over the child's tiny form. She noted its strange duality, comforting, yet undeniably potent, gentle, yet capable of quiet devastation. She had heard whispers of accidents, of children who never awoke, of midwives and physicians haunted by the subtle seduction of the chemical. Dr. Fairchild lowered the cloth with care. The infant inhaled, her chest rising with shallow, rhythmic breaths. The vapor crept into her tiny lungs, carrying a warmth that dulled the crying, dulled the trembling, dulled the senses, just enough to suspend pain. Lady Eleanor's fingers tightened around the edge of the bassinet, her eyes following every rise and fall, every subtle flutter of eyelashes. Her heart pounded, a faint drum against the quiet room, marking each fragile second. Minutes stretched, taut and delicate. The infant's body softened, her limbs slackening with a trust she could not comprehend. Dr. Fairchild counted silently, whispering each second in his mind, aware that even the slightest miscalculation could tip the balance between relief and peril. Lady Eleanor bit her lip, torn between gratitude and terror. She had asked for a miracle, and yet the scent curling through the air carried a danger she could neither ignore nor fully measure. Outside, the streets of London were cloaked in fog, muffling the cries of labourers, the clatter of carriage wheels, the distant tolling of church bells. Inside the nursery, time seemed to suspend itself. The child breathed quietly, steadily, yet Lady Eleanor could not shake the awareness that every breath under the vapour was borrowed from the fragile, impermanent air that sustained life. The nurse, standing to the side, held her hand near the infant, ready to intervene at the first sign of distress. She had seen chloroform work many times, had witnessed its ability to soothe and to steal, and she understood the narrow margin upon which this miracle balanced. Every inhale could be a blessing or a thief. Finally, Dr. Fairchild removed the cloth. The infant stirred, tiny fists curling against the soft cotton, eyes blinking open to meet her mother's gaze. A sigh of relief filled the room, mingling with the lingering fragrance of the vapour. Lady Eleanor reached down, cradling her child with a tenderness sharpened by fear. She understood, now more than ever, the double-edged nature of the chemical marvel she had entrusted with her daughter's fragile life. Chloroform remained in the room, an invisible presence, sweet and silent, a promise and a warning entwined. London itself would never notice. Yet within these walls, the infant's first sleep under its influence had left an indelible mark, a delicate memory of mercy, of power, and of the invisible hand that could lull even the tiniest body toward quiet oblivion. And as the night settled, Lady Eleanor pressed the child to her chest, inhaling lightly, tasting the faint perfume, and praying that mercy had come without cost. In the narrow alleyways of Fleet Street, where the fog clung to bricks like damp wool, there existed a chemist whose reputation had once been untarnished. Mr. Alistair Berridge had spent decades perfecting the delicate art of compounding remedies, blending powders, tinctures, and oils with the precision of a watchmaker. His shop was a haven of order, bottles gleaming like jewels, scales balanced with meticulous care, and the scent of herbs and distilled alcohol mingling to create an air both soothing and authoritative. Yet in recent months, Berridge's world had begun to unravel, not with a bang nor a crash, but with the quiet, perfumed whisper of chloroform. At first, he had regarded the substance with curiosity and professional interest. A marvel, he thought, a tool for relief that could spare patients the agony of tooth extraction, of surgical incision, of childbirth. Its sweet, floral scent had been almost enchanting, a perfume of mercy that lingered delicately in the nostrils and promised nothing but ease. And indeed, it had delivered on that promise countless times, in the careful hands of trained surgeons and obstetricians. But soon the reports reached him, quiet whispers first, then letters, then the murmured horror of colleagues. Patients had failed to awaken. Children had lain still in beds, their breath shallow, their pulses faint, their lives slipping away under the perfumed veil. The margin of safety was narrower than any chemist had believed, and Berridge, whose life had been devoted to precision and measurement, felt the weight of responsibility pressing upon him. It was in the dim light of his shop, one damp evening, that he resolved to speak. He placed a small, sealed bottle of chloroform on the counter, its liquid glimmering faintly in the glow of the gas lamp. A colleague had come, curious about the latest developments in anesthesia. Berridge spoke in a voice barely above a whisper, as if the vapor itself might overhear. "It is too powerful," he said. "Too easily misused. Too easily fatal. I cannot, in good conscience, supply it indiscriminately. The deaths, they are too many, and they will rise." His words were met with polite skepticism. The colleagues, steeped in the elegance of Victorian progress, reminded him that chloroform was endorsed by prominent physicians, praised in polite society, and even approved in some circles by those within the royal household. Its marvel was celebrated, its failures were hushed. Berridge, however, could not be persuaded. The ledger of incidents haunted him, each entry a ghostly echo of breaths stolen too gently, lives extinguished too quietly. In the days that followed, he penned letters to medical societies, detailing his observations with painstaking care. He recounted the inconsistencies, the unpredictability, the tragedies hidden beneath polite euphemisms. "Even the most careful administration," he wrote, "cannot account for the delicate and treacherous nature of the substance. It is a poison masquerading as relief." Yet the response was slow, and the indifference of society stung. The chemist's warnings were softened in printed journals, diluted by cautious phrasing. "Rare complications," the editors noted. "Exceptional cases." Nothing, no matter how meticulous, could capture the subtle terror he had observed firsthand. The way chloroform, perfumed and gentle, claimed lives without trace, leaving only absence and the faint sweetness of air. Berridge, weary and haunted, returned to his bottles each evening, polishing the glass, rearranging the shelves, inhaling only the faintest hint of the vapor to remind himself of its potency. He understood that in Victorian Britain, miracles and menace often walked hand in hand, and that chloroform, the most elegant of tools, had revealed itself as both. His shop remained a haven, but he no longer trusted it fully, not the vapor, not the world, not the promises of progress that could so quietly betray the lives it touched. And so, the chemist who cried fraud became a solitary sentinel, the scent of chloroform curling endlessly through his nostrils, carrying both the allure of relief and the shadow of silent death. The ward at St. Agnes's Hospital was heavy with the early chill of winter, each corridor lined with iron-framed beds, each floorboard worn smooth by decades of hurried footsteps. Gas lamps cast trembling shadows along the walls, their light flickering like the pulse of the city outside, which rolled on in fog and foghorns, while inside, a subtler drama unfolded, a quiet, deadly ballet performed under the perfumed influence of chloroform. Dr. Lionel Harcourt moved among the patients, stethoscope pressed carefully to each chest, listening, counting, measuring the fragile life that pulsed beneath the skin. His fingers were steady, trained to detect the faintest irregularity, yet his mind was weighed down with knowledge he could scarcely speak aloud. For chloroform, he had learned, was both marvel and menace, capable of delivering dreamless relief and, in a heartbeat, complete stillness. At bed number 4 lay a young seamstress, her small frame swathed in linen, pale and trembling beneath the heated blankets. She had been administered the vapor for a minor procedure, nothing more than the extraction of a small abscess, but the effects had been immediate. Her body had softened as if gravity itself had claimed her, and now, beneath the stethoscope, her heartbeat was faint, irregular, each thump a fragile thread binding her to the waking world. Harcourt leaned closer, counting the beats carefully, whispering the numbers into the silent room, as though speaking too loudly might shatter the tenuous rhythm. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The interval stretched longer than it should. He adjusted the stethoscope, repositioned his hand, but the beat remained faint, elusive. His pulse quickened, echoing the delicate struggle he monitored. 10, 11, 12. Each beat a reminder that the line between life and silence was as narrow as a hair. The nurse on duty, Mary Collins, stood nearby, her hands folded at her waist, eyes darting between the patient and the doctor. She had seen chloroform work before, had watched children and adults drift into peaceful unconsciousness, yet this, the wavering of a pulse that might vanish in an instant, filled her with quiet terror. She swallowed against the lump in her throat, aware that her own breath mingled with the lingering scent of the vapor, faint, floral, almost seductive, curling around the ward in delicate threads. "Steady," Harcourt murmured to the seamstress, as though the sound of his voice might anchor her to the world. "Steady. Breathe with me." The girl's chest rose in a shallow rhythm, each inhale a tentative promise, each exhale a fragile surrender. Harcourt counted aloud for reassurance, his words a metronome, each second measured with painstaking care. Around him, the ward seemed suspended, time dilated, every sound muted except for the faint rustle of linen, the distant echo of a footstep in the corridor, and the faint, persistent perfume of chloroform. Minutes passed like hours. The stethoscope transmitted each heartbeat, delicate and tenuous. Harcourt's hands were steady now, though tension pressed against his shoulders like a weight he could not shake. The vapor, gentle and perfumed, had taken hold of the seamstress, yet she remained tethered to the living world, her pulse faltering but present a thin thread he dared not let break. Finally, with measured care, Harcourt adjusted the cloth, ensuring the vapor would subside, allowing the girl to awaken slowly, safely. Her eyes fluttered open, confusion mingling with relief, and the ward exhaled as one the spell broken, yet the memory of the near silence lingering like smoke in the corners. Harcourt removed the stethoscope and pressed a hand to his brow, the soft, perfumed presence of chloroform still lingering. He understood fully, as he had never before, that in Victorian London, miracles carried shadows, and every faint beat of the stethoscope was a reminder that life's thread could be stolen in silence beneath the most innocent of perfumes. The courtroom at the Old Bailey smelled faintly of polished wood, ink, and candle wax, mingling with the cold breath of winter fog that had seeped through the tall, iron-framed windows. Rows of spectators murmured quietly, their voices hushed as if anticipating a revelation of both scandal and horror. The case had captured London's attention with the velocity of a carriage through fog. Chloroform, the sweet, perfumed vapor celebrated in hospitals and drawing rooms alike, had become the instrument of accusation. A man, slender, pale, and unnervingly composed, stood accused of using the invisible weapon to claim life with elegance, ease, and terrifying subtlety. He was the city's first silent murderer, and the court's attention had turned to the vapor itself as much as to him. Mr. Samuel Wren, the accused, maintained his posture with meticulous precision, his hands folded lightly in front of him, eyes dark and steady beneath the flickering gas lamps. The judge, stern and unyielding, peered over his spectacles at the gathered witnesses, court officers, and members of the public. The clerk's voice rose, noting the names and titles that would later be recorded in heavy volumes, a faint echo of permanence against the ephemeral nature of the crime itself. The prosecution presented their first witness, a nurse who had observed the subtle application of chloroform on a young child. Her voice trembled as she described the process, how the cloth had been held to the child's face, how the faint floral scent had curled through the room, and how the young lungs had slowed beneath the invisible weight of the vapor. Each word was careful, precise, yet tinged with the quiet terror of recollection. She paused occasionally to steady herself, aware that even a breath too loud could shatter the delicate tension of the court. Dr. Percival Thorne followed, called to recount incidents he had meticulously recorded in hospital ledgers. He spoke of fainted men, of children who never awoke, of the subtlety with which chloroform rendered its victims peaceful, pliant, and utterly still. "There is no trace," he said softly, "no visible mark upon the body to indicate violence. Yet life has been claimed. The vapor is silent, precise, and in these hands it becomes a weapon." The court absorbed this with a mixture of fascination and unease, the words hanging in the air like the scent of the substance itself, sweet, perfumed, and terrifyingly invisible. Wren's defense was elegant and restrained. He spoke of chloroform as a medical marvel, a substance employed in good faith by physicians across the empire. He argued that the deaths were accidents, miscalculations of dosage or timing, not evidence of malice or intent. The jury listened, rapt, but every whispered account of the silent deaths outside the courtroom walls gnawed at the edges of certainty. London had witnessed the marvel of chloroform, yet now it demanded accountability for the shadows it left in its wake. Witness after witness described the vapor's subtle menace, the delicate line between mercy and peril, and how easily it could be wielded by someone with knowledge, intent, or sometimes mere carelessness. The judge's gaze swept over the proceedings, recognizing the unprecedented nature of the case, a killer unseen, a crime so perfumed and silent that it defied conventional understanding. As the trial progressed, the courtroom itself seemed to hold its breath. Even the gas lamps flickered as though uncertain of the proceedings. Each testimony painted chloroform as both miracle and menace, its sweet scent becoming the thread connecting the accused, the victims, and the collective horror of a city that had come to trust its invisible hand. By the end of the day, the jury retired, leaving the courtroom in tense silence. Outside, London's fog pressed against the windows, curling into the chamber with the same patient, perfumed persistence as the vapor itself. The city would await its verdict, but in the hearts and minds of all present, a more chilling truth had settled. Chloroform did not merely heal, nor merely soothe. It could, in silence and sweetness, wield death with merciless precision, and the judgment, when it came, would be only a whisper against the quiet, pervasive power of the vapor that had ensnared an empire. The night settled over London with the slow inevitability of fog rolling through narrow streets, creeping into alleys and pressing against the stone walls of hospitals like a living thing. Within St. Bartholomew's, the wards were dimly lit by flickering gas lamps, their flame catching on polished metal, on glass vials, on the iron rails of beds where patients lay wrapped in blankets and quiet suffering. The smell of carbolic mingled with the faint, sweet trace of chloroform, a fragrance as delicate as it was deadly, drifting through the corridors like an invisible sentinel. Nurse Matilda Hargrove made her rounds, her boots silent on the worn floorboards. She had been tending these wards for years, accustomed to the cries of the ill, the soft rattle of coughs, the shuffling of attendants. But tonight the air felt different, thicker, heavier, scented with a subtle danger that pricked at the edges of her consciousness. It was a reminder that chloroform, though hailed as a marvel, demanded vigilance beyond ordinary human endurance. One misstep, one careless breath, one moment of inattention, and life could vanish quietly, leaving only the perfumed trace of absence. Bed number 6 was a small figure swaddled in blankets, a child of no more than 5 who had been admitted earlier that evening with a high fever and labored breathing. The vapor had been administered briefly to ease her suffering, a measured quantity intended to calm without harm. Matilda leaned close, pressing her ear gently to the child's chest, counting the rise and fall of each frail breath. 1, 2, 3. The seconds stretched taut, fragile as spun glass. She noted the subtle flutter of eyelids, the faint pink of lips, the almost imperceptible rhythm that tethered the child to the world. In the surgical theatre, Dr. Frederick Langley adjusted the cloth over the next patient, an elderly man awaiting a routine extraction. His pulse had been steady before the vapor, yet Langley counted every heartbeat with the solemnity of a man aware that the margin between life and oblivion was narrower than the finest thread. One miscalculation, one lapse of attention, and the sweet, invisible power could claim him as easily as it had claimed countless others. The lamps flickered low as the wind pressed against the hospital walls, a reminder of the world beyond the wards that continued in blissful ignorance. The scent of chloroform drifted softly, curling through corridors and corners, brushing against the noses of nurses and apprentices, testing their focus, their resolve. Some inhaled it too deeply without realizing, a faint dizziness brushing the edge of their minds. Others, like Matilda, refused to breathe it in, guarding themselves as if their vigilance alone could protect the fragile lives under their care. Minutes passed, marked only by the faint hiss of gas and the soft, deliberate counting of breaths. In each bed, patients rested under the gentle but treacherous embrace of the vapor, unaware of how close they had come to slipping entirely into a dream from which they might not return. The ward was a cathedral of quiet, a place suspended between mercy and peril, where the sweet scent of chloroform lingered as both promise and threat. By midnight, the lamps burned low, casting long, wavering shadows along the walls. Matilda paused in the central corridor, surveying the rows of iron beds, each holding a sleeping form suspended between waking and oblivion. She understood, with the stark clarity of long experience, that the hospital itself was held hostage by the vapor, a quiet ruler, delicate yet unyielding, capable of comforting, subduing, and, if misused, taking life without struggle or sound. Outside, London slept beneath its blanket of fog, oblivious to the quiet peril threading through its hospitals, drawing breath from the living while leaving only its perfumed echo behind. Within the wards, the lamps cast a soft, wavering glow, illuminating faces serene and still, a testament to chloroform's dual nature. Mercy and menace entwined in every fragrant molecule. And as the night deepened, the ward exhaled in silence, knowing that when the lamps burned low, the world was watching, yet unaware of the invisible hand that moved among the sleeping sweet and deadly, claiming neither attention nor blame, only the quiet obedience of life rendered fragile beneath a perfumed veil. Dr. Reginald Ashcombe had once been celebrated among his colleagues for steady hands, meticulous technique, and an unwavering dedication to the relief of suffering. In the polished corridors of St. Luke's Hospital, he had administered chloroform countless times, marveling at the silence it brought, at the soft, dreamlike repose of patients who would have screamed, writhed, or flinched under the unyielding knife. The vapor was a miracle. He had believed a gentle thief that removed agony with elegance and grace. Yet that belief had been shattered, not by theory or rumor, but by the stark reality of death too quiet to ignore. It had been a minor procedure, or so it was thought, a young seamstress with a simple laceration on her forearm. Ashcombe had administered the cloth with careful precision, counted each drop, monitored each pulse, and yet, in the span of seconds, the young woman's chest had risen faintly and faltered. Her eyes had fluttered in the gaslit theatre, her fingers slackened, her small body suspended between life and the oblivion that threatened to claim her. Ashcombe had pulled the cloth away, pressed a hand to her chest, murmured urgent reassurances, and waited for the fragile, tremulous return of breath. When she finally inhaled, when colour returned faintly to her cheeks, he had exhaled, but the relief had been hollow, the knowledge of what nearly transpired pressing against his ribcage like an iron band. From that day onward, Ashcombe refused to administer chloroform again. He sat now in his private study, a small room overlooking the quiet, fog-choked streets of London. His hands, once steady beneath the theatre's bright gas lamps, trembled slightly as he reviewed the ledger of patients he had treated under the vapor's influence. Names, dates, procedures, doses, all recorded with the meticulous care of a man who understood that each entry represented a breath borrowed, a life suspended, a mercy that could have turned into tragedy in the faintest moment of miscalculation. He thought of the apprentices, their young eyes wide as he had demonstrated the vapor's effect, of nurses who refused to inhale it themselves, standing vigilant against its seductive power, of colleagues who boasted of its perfection, who inhaled lightly themselves to steady hands and nerves, unaware of the shadow lurking within the sweet-scented air. And he thought of his patients, of the faces pale beneath the linen, of the silence that followed, the quiet obedience that chloroform exacted, and the faint, bruised perfume that lingered long after it had released its hold. Ashcombe's conscience would not allow further use. He wrote letters to the hospital board, to colleagues, to medical societies, warning of the hidden danger, of the narrow margin between relief and catastrophe. His words were measured, cautious, tempered by both duty and the social decorum of Victorian society. Yet they carried an urgency born of personal experience. Chloroform was not merely a tool, it was a force, delicate and deadly, capable of stealing life with a perfumed hand. Outside, the fog pressed against the study window, muffling the carriage wheels, the distant cries, the city's nocturnal pulse. Inside, Ashcombe lit a candle, its glow dancing across the shelves lined with medical tomes and carefully labelled bottles. The vapour, sweet and silent, lingered in memory if not in air, and he could still smell it faintly, as though it had followed him into the quiet of the night. He leaned back in his chair, gaze fixed upon the flickering flame. He understood with stark clarity that the city, the hospitals, and even the royal household had embraced chloroform without fully reckoning with its duality. Relief and menace, mercy and peril entwined in each fragrant drop. Ashcombe's decision was firm. He would no longer wield the vapour. He would no longer trust its sweetness. And in the quiet of his study, the physician who had once marvelled at chloroform's grace felt only the weight of its shadow and the knowledge that Victorian Britain had been drawn, willingly, into its perfumed, dangerous embrace. The cemetery beyond Whitechapel was a solemn expanse of stone and shadow, fog curling between headstones like pale fingers brushing the grass. Each monument bore the weight of names, dates, and ages carved meticulously in granite. Yet in recent months, a new pattern had emerged. Fresh stones appeared with alarming regularity, small graves for children, young men, and women who had seemed robust only hours before. The caretakers whispered among themselves, their words cautious, tentative, as though naming the cause might summon it to linger. Mrs. Amelia Garrow walked the paths slowly, her skirts brushing the damp earth, eyes fixed upon the most recent markers. One after another, the dates aligned too closely with hospital admissions, with the subtle, perfumed signature that had begun to haunt the city. The scent of lilacs and damp soil mingled with an almost imperceptible sweetness, the trace of chloroform clinging faintly to the graves, as though even in death it refused to vanish entirely. She paused beside a small marble cross, polished and wet with rain. A child, no more than 7, lay beneath it, the epitaph brief, formal, sanitized, taken too soon. But Amelia knew better. She had followed the whispers, read the ledgers, attended funerals where grief was softened by polite euphemism. The child had been administered chloroform for a minor procedure, had inhaled the scented vapor, and had slipped quietly into a sleep from which she did not awaken. The caretaker, a gaunt man with a hunch of age and exhaustion, passed by, spade in hand. "Too many, ma'am," he murmured, glancing at the rows of small stones. "Too many too young, and it's that new vapor everyone talks about. Doctors say it's safe, but safe seems a distant word these days." Amelia nodded, swallowing against the lump in her throat. She walked onward, each footstep pressing into the soft earth that had been disturbed again and again over recent weeks. The fog thickened, curling around her like a cloak, and in its folds she imagined the vapor rising once more, invisible, perfumed, claiming lives silently, precisely, mercilessly. She shivered despite the wool lining her coat. In the distance, a family arrived at a fresh plot, their carriage wheels muting into the thick fog. They carried flowers, and the children clutched small tokens in trembling hands. Amelia watched them with a hollow ache. The same fragrance that had haunted her grief, that had claimed her husband, now seemed to touch the air around every visitor, a quiet reminder of the invisible hand guiding life to silence. Nearby, a nurse from one of the hospitals crossed the paths, her eyes scanning the graves with familiar sorrow. She had counted too many breaths, monitored too many pulses, and seen the perfumed hand of chloroform claim too many lives to count. Her steps were slow, deliberate, as if walking on fragile threads of conscience. Each grave confirmed what she had long feared. Medicine, when mixed with ambition, with novelty, with the sweet intoxication of progress, could become indistinguishable from peril. Amelia knelt beside a grave, pressing her hand against the wet earth, tracing the letters that had been carved hastily. Mary Thompson, aged 8. She could almost feel the faint flutter of a small chest beneath the soil, the delicate inhale of a life stolen too quietly, too completely. The scent, faint and persistent, lingered in her memory, the soft floral trace that marked every administration, every inhalation that had crossed the boundary between mercy and death. The city beyond the cemetery hummed unaware, carriages rattling, footsteps echoing on cobblestones, gas lamps flickering along fogged streets. Yet here, among the freshly turned earth and the pale new stones, a truth weighed heavier than fog or stone. Chloroform had become a silent arbiter, a perfumed shadow threading through hospitals, drawing rooms, and, finally, graveyards with too many fresh markers to ignore. Amelia rose, straightening her skirts against the damp grass, and walked the paths once more. Each step echoed with the lives claimed quietly, leaving behind only sweet air, small stones, and the unshakable understanding that mercy could be deadly, and progress could bear the fragrance of grief. The royal apartments at Buckingham Palace were still, their vast rooms dimly lit by the muted glow of gas chandeliers. Winter had pressed its chill against the windows, yet inside, the air was warm with the faint fragrance of polished wood, beeswax, and the subtle trace of rosewater. Queen Victoria sat in her study, a small volume of medical reports open on her lap, her gaze fixed on the delicate handwriting that recorded the effects of chloroform. The vapor had once seemed a miracle, a balm to the pains of childbirth, a mercy for the infirm. Now, as whispers of near disasters and silent deaths reached even the palace corridors, her confidence faltered. Dr. John Snow, summoned to advise, moved with quiet purpose, careful to maintain the decorum demanded by royalty. His coat brushed the polished floor as he approached the Queen, carrying papers, reports, and the subtle weight of knowledge. Snow had been present during several administrations of the vapor, in both private and public settings. He had seen the beauty, the elegance, the relief, but he had also seen the shadows, the faint blue of lips, the faltering pulse, the stillness too absolute to ignore. "Your Majesty," he said softly, bowing, "I must report that while chloroform is undeniably effective in relieving pain, there have been occurrences in which its administration has led to serious complications. In some instances, patients have failed to awaken." His voice was deliberate, tempered with respect, yet underlaid with urgency. Victoria's fingers tightened around the edges of the report. Her eyes, steady beneath the weight of years and responsibility, scanned the words once more. Letters from hospitals, observations from midwives, accounts of children and adults alike. Each instance bore the same haunting signature, a faintly sweet aroma lingering in the air, lives suspended, and sometimes claimed, with no outward trace. The very substance she had once embraced as a miracle now seemed an unpredictable spectre. "Impossible," she whispered, more to herself than to Snow. "How can something meant to protect, to comfort, fail so completely?" Snow shook his head gently. "The vapor does not yield fully to intent, Your Majesty. Even in the most careful hands, its potency can surprise. The line between relief and peril is thinner than one might imagine." Outside, the winter fog pressed against the palace walls, curling into the corners of corridors, carrying with it the distant sounds of carriage wheels and muffled footsteps. Within, a silence fell, heavy as velvet, punctuated only by the soft rustle of papers and the Queen's measured breathing. Victoria closed the volume slowly, her mind tracing the path of the vapor through hospitals, parlor rooms, nurseries, and drawing rooms. She had endorsed its use with the authority of the Crown, lending it the legitimacy that swept through London and beyond. Mothers, midwives, surgeons, each had been reassured by the knowledge that the monarch had placed her trust in the substance's gentle efficacy. But the reports Snow had delivered were undeniable. Even the royal sanction could not negate the tragedies that had followed. Her gaze drifted to the small vial resting on the side table, a ceremonial sample brought from the laboratories for her inspection. The liquid inside shimmered innocently, yet she knew what it could do. The fragrance, subtle and alluring, lingered faintly, a perfumed reminder of both mercy and menace. Snow hesitated, sensing the Queen's turmoil. "Your Majesty, it is not my place to dictate action, only to counsel caution. Perhaps the vapor should be reserved, limited, administered with greater oversight." Victoria nodded slowly, the weight of responsibility pressing upon her. She had once seen chloroform as a triumph of human ingenuity, a gift to ease suffering. Now she saw it for what it truly was: a force that could soothe or steel, a delicate arbiter that demanded respect and vigilance. Even royal endorsement, she realized, could falter before its quiet, perfumed power. And in that vast, silent room, with the faint scent of chloroform curling like smoke in the corners, Queen Victoria understood that the marvel she had once trusted so fully now carried a shadow darker than any candlelight, stretching across her empire with a soft, lethal grace. The committee convened in a narrow, wood-panelled chamber at the heart of Whitehall, where the scent of aged paper and polished brass mingled with the faint chill that seeped through the draughty windows. Outside, London pressed upon itself, wrapped in a dense fog that crept through alleyways, curling around gas lamps and over cobblestones like a quiet, persistent predator. Inside, a different sort of fog settled among the assembled men and women, the fog of fear, uncertainty, and the slow, perfumed shadow of chloroform. The committee had been hastily formed at the behest of the Board of Health, summoned after a series of troubling incidents. Reports had filtered in from hospitals, drawing rooms, and even private households, whispers of patients who had not awoken, children lost beneath the delicate hand of a vapor once heralded as a miracle. Physicians, midwives, nurses, and apothecaries alike had contributed testimony, their words precise yet tinged with dread. Now, in this chamber, those fragments of fear coalesced into a heavier, more pressing weight. Dr. Jonathan Keene, a man accustomed to the controlled precision of the surgical theatre, stood at the head of the table, hands folded over a leather-bound ledger. His eyes, sharp beneath spectacles, scanned the assembled members. "Gentlemen, ladies," he began, voice measured, "we are confronted with a substance that defies conventional control. Chloroform, celebrated as a marvel of modern medicine, has demonstrated a capacity for mortality that is both subtle and profound. Its administration has been linked to several unexplained deaths, despite careful oversight." A murmur passed around the chamber, soft but uneasy. The attendants, some of them medical men of experience, shifted in their chairs. They had all seen the effects firsthand, bodies softened, eyes fluttering, breath thinning beneath the fragrant veil of the vapor. And yet, their minds clung to its promise of relief, its perceived inevitability in the progress of science. One member, Sir Reginald Blackwood, tapped his cane against the floor, the sound sharp against the low hum of tension. "Surely, these incidents are anomalies. The vapor is administered widely, in households and hospitals alike. If it were inherently dangerous, would it not have claimed more lives indiscriminately?" His question hung in the air, polite, yet brittle. Dr. Keene's fingers pressed against the ledger, tracing the entries of names, dates, and causes of death, each a careful euphemism for a life taken under the perfumed hand of chloroform. "Anomalies?" he asked, voice low, deliberate. "Anomalies cannot account for the patterns. Children, adults, laboring mothers' cases stretch across both wealth and class. The line between relief and peril is far narrower than we dare admit." Another member, a matron of considerable experience in obstetric wards, raised her hand. "We cannot dismiss the vapor entirely. It eases suffering, prevents agony, and has facilitated countless procedures. To abandon it entirely would be to consign patients to pain we now have the means to avoid." Dr. Keene's gaze swept over the room. He understood the tension advancement weighed against caution, hope against fear. Yet chloroform was not a tool to be wielded lightly. Its grace was deceptive, its sweetness concealing peril that demanded vigilance beyond the capacity of ordinary hands. He tapped the ledger, his knuckles whitening. "We must not be seduced by its promise alone. There must be regulation, oversight, and acknowledgement of the deaths it has caused. The public cannot remain unaware, nor can we continue to cloak it in euphemism." The chamber fell silent, each member caught between loyalty to progress and the undeniable, perfumed menace that lingered in the margins of the reports. The fog outside pressed closer, swirling against the windows, as if echoing the uncertainty within. Chloroform, sweet and invisible, seemed to hang just beyond the glass, a silent witness to the debate, a subtle arbiter of life and death. And so the committee deliberated into the night, aware that every decision they made or failed to make would carry consequences as quiet and pervasive as the vapor itself. In London, the city continued its breathless routine, oblivious to the scrutiny, oblivious to the danger, while within Whitehall, men and women wrestled with a truth that was perfumed, silent, and deadly. Chloroform, once heralded as mercy, had become a spectre of fear, threading its influence through every ward, drawing room, and nursery with patient inevitability. The evening air in the parish hall of St. Mary's was thick with smoke from oil lamps, and the faint chill of winter seeping through the cracked windows. Fathers, mothers, and guardians sat in tense clusters on wooden benches, the murmur of worry weaving between them like restless spirits. Among them was Mr. Thomas Grayson, a man of sturdy build and prematurely lined face, who had come seeking answers, seeking justice, seeking the faintest whisper of mercy for the child whose breath had been stolen beneath the perfumed haze of chloroform. He rose at last, shoulders stiff, eyes burning with a quiet fury. The attending physician, Dr. Alistair Morton, regarded him cautiously, aware of the storm he carried. "Sir," Morton said gently, "I assure you, I do not want assurances," Grayson interrupted, voice low but intense, carrying through the hall. "I want the truth. I want to know how a man trained in the care of life can allow my daughter, my little Annabel, to slip into that sleep from which she never awoke." The hall fell silent, the weight of his grief pressing against every wooden bench, every shadowed corner. Mothers clutched their own children closer, fathers shifted uneasily, the faint, lingering scent of chloroform still in the air, its memory of sweetness a cruel echo of the peril it carried. Morton adjusted his spectacles, attempting calm. "Mr. Grayson, the administration was according to the accepted practice. Chloroform, when measured correctly, offers relief from pain. Its risks, while present, are considered minimal by contemporary standards." Grayson's fists clenched. "Minimal, minimal," he repeated, each word sharp as flint. "You call it minimal when a child, tender and small, lies silent in the hospital as if stolen by angels too cruel to intervene. My daughter trusted you. She inhaled, and in those moments, she was mine, and yet the vapor claimed her, as silently as a thief in the night." A murmur ran through the hall. Nurses shifted uncomfortably, glancing at one another, acutely aware of the truth woven through the father's words. The perfumed spectre that had haunted wards and nurseries alike now haunted the public, summoned into consciousness by grief too sharp to be softened by polite euphemisms. "Sir," Dr. Morton said carefully, "I understand your sorrow, but the vapor, do not speak of it as if it were benign," Grayson interjected, voice cracking, eyes wet with tears he could not restrain. "Do not call it medicine. Do not call it mercy. It is a thief. It steals life with elegance, with subtlety, with no one to witness but the breath it claims. I demand no. I plead that someone acknowledge the truth, that the danger be known, that parents understand the risk." His words echoed against the high ceilings, each syllable a hammer striking the conscience of every listener. Behind him, a small group of physicians shifted, some lowering their eyes, others stiffening with discomfort. The vapor's elegance had shielded it, cloaked it in the language of progress and modernity, yet here it was laid bare in grief and fury, the sweetness of its scent transformed into accusation. "Your plea," Morton said at last, voice heavy with both respect and sorrow, "will be heard. We shall review the procedures, the administration, and the outcomes. Chloroform is potent, yes, and we must proceed with vigilance. But the burden of this tragedy rests lightly upon no one alone. It is the consequence of a marvel that has yet to be fully understood. Grayson's shoulders slumped slightly, though the fire in his gaze remained. He sank onto the bench, hands trembling, and whispered a soft prayer for his daughter. Around him, others absorbed the warning. Their own children held closer, their own understanding sharpened by the father's desperate voice. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows, curling around the parish as if listening. And somewhere in London, in the quiet of gaslit wards and shadowed nurseries, chloroform lingered, perfumed, subtle, and as silent as ever, its promise of mercy now irrevocably entwined with the grief of a father who had witnessed its hidden hand. In the back corridors of St. Bartholomew's, where shadows pooled beneath high ceilings and the distant hum of the city seeped faintly through thick walls, a cadre of surgeons gathered. Their hands were steady, gloved and pale, their eyes alert under the flicker of gas lamps. The air was thick with the faint, lingering sweetness of chloroform, curling invisibly around every instrument, every polished table, every carefully folded linen cloth. Here, in these corridors and theatres, it was no longer merely a tool, it was an obsession, a delicate companion, a fragrance that commanded loyalty as quietly as it claimed breath. Dr. Edward Langston, tall and precise, adjusted the small vial on the side table, noting how the liquid shimmered faintly under the lamp's glow. He inhaled a shallow breath, not enough to disrupt his steadiness, merely enough to remind himself of its potency. Around him, his colleagues did the same, drawing lightly from the sweet, perfumed air, as though its subtle warmth steadied their hands more effectively than any measured count or lecture ever could. Chloroform had become both assistant and talisman, a fragrant whisper that spoke of control, skill, and the promise of perfect procedure. "Are we confident?" Dr. Harcourt asked quietly, his eyes scanning the room, lingering on the faint shadows along the walls. His tone carried no challenge, only the tremor of men aware of what they were handling. "We administer it daily, yet even now, the margin between mastery and disaster feels perilously thin." Langston nodded, glancing down at the patient on the table, a young clerk, anxious and trembling. The vapor would carry him into a gentle oblivion, or so they believed. Every movement was deliberate. The placement of the cloth, the exact tilt of the head, the subtle timing of each inhalation. In these moments, the surgeons clung to the sweet air as one might cling to a lifeline tossed across a storm-tossed river. Its perfume was both reassurance and danger, a duality that demanded vigilance and reverence. Across the room, Dr. Pembroke murmured an incantation of numbers and seconds, counting each heartbeat under his breath, the sound soft enough to be lost beneath the quiet hiss of the lamps. The patient's chest rose in slow, precise rhythm, limbs slack yet alive, eyes fluttering beneath closed lids. The surgeons inhaled lightly, drawing upon the vapor's calming embrace to steady nerves, to quiet the tremors that never fully vanished, no matter how experienced they became. Yet even as they relied on the sweet air, the memory of near tragedies lingered, ghosts of children who had not awakened, of laborers rendered silent, of midwives and nurses who had refused the inhale themselves, preserving their clarity of mind while witnessing the peril unfold. Chloroform's elegance, its perfumed seduction, carried a subtle threat that never fully receded, no matter how many procedures were completed without incident. Langston's hand hovered above the cloth, counting the seconds with meticulous attention. The vapor drifted upward, curling like smoke, brushing lightly against the patient's face. Its sweetness was comforting, almost tender, yet beneath that softness lay the shadow of absolute obedience. The patient's body yielded effortlessly, utterly, to a force both invisible and unyielding. Every rise and fall of the chest reminded the surgeons that mastery was an illusion. The margin between relief and disaster remained as delicate as spun glass. When the procedure concluded, and the patient awoke quietly, the surgeons exhaled collectively, though no one spoke. They had survived another encounter with the perfumed predator. The lamps flickered softly, the vapor lingering faintly in the corners, a reminder of its presence, patient and unyielding. They had administered, controlled, and emerged unscathed, but the memory of sweet air, of subtle danger, would remain forever entwined with their practice, a silent, perfumed witness to every decision, every breath, every life entrusted to its merciless care. Outside, London moved on, unaware of the fragrance threading through hospitals, theatres, and drawing rooms alike. Inside, the surgeons continued their rounds, clinging to the sweet air, their loyalty tempered by awe, fear, and the quiet knowledge that chloroform demanded obedience even from those who believed they commanded it. The corridors of St. Giles Hospital smelled faintly of antiseptic, heated linseed oil, and the lingering sweetness of chloroform, a scent that had become inescapable, subtle, yet ever present in the memory of every nurse and surgeon who worked within its walls. Outside, the fog of London pressed against the tall windows, curling through narrow alleys and gaslit streets, while inside, a new promise had begun to circulate. An anesthetic touted as safer, gentler, and less capricious than the perfumed vapor that had both mesmerized and haunted the city. Dr. Edward Fairchild, appointed to oversee the introduction of the new substance, walked slowly through the ward, noting the anxious expressions of nurses, the tension in the shoulders of young apprentices, the wary glances of patients who had already heard whispers of chloroform's subtle dangers. Ether, they called it the new anesthetic, distilled and distilled again, designed to ease pain without threatening life. Its arrival promised relief from the constant fear that had shadowed every administration of chloroform. Yet the scent lingered faintly, a reminder of the lessons that blood and experience had taught. A young mother, recently delivered of her first child, lay in bed number 12, swaddled in blankets scented faintly with lavender. Dr. Fairchild approached, holding the apparatus with deliberate care. Nurses gathered at his side, hands poised, eyes attentive, aware that even with the new vapor, vigilance was paramount. The mother's breaths came shallow and uneven, a fragile rhythm that demanded respect, patience, and precise timing. The advantage of ether, Fairchild explained softly to the observing surgeons and midwives, is its predictability. Unlike chloroform, it allows a gentler descent into unconsciousness. Yet we must remember, even safety is measured, never absolute. Each patient is a delicate mechanism, and every inhalation a negotiation with life itself. He demonstrated with meticulous care, guiding the cloth saturated with ether toward the young mother's face. The vapor rose slowly, curling in thin, pale threads, subtle enough to reassure yet potent enough to command attention. The mother's body softened, eyelids fluttering, fingers loosening from the sheets. Unlike chloroform, the descent was gradual, a gentle drift rather than a sudden surrender. The room exhaled in quiet relief, though the nurses and apprentices remained vigilant, counting pulses, measuring respiration, and watching for even the slightest falter. In the corner, Dr. Samuel Pembroke, an older surgeon with decades of experience, observed the procedure with a mixture of awe and cautious skepticism. He had seen chloroform claim life in the most ordinary procedures, its elegance betraying lethal consequences, and he regarded ether with tempered hope. Could it truly offer the balance of relief and safety that the city so desperately needed? Could it hold the promise of a merciful hand without the silent shadow that had followed chloroform into every ward and nursery? Minutes passed like hours. The young mother's breathing remained steady, her body relaxed yet alive, and the first hints of a smile touched her lips as consciousness returned. Fairchild removed the cloth carefully, and the nurses noted the subtle difference. The descent and return had been smooth, precise, almost tender, without the abruptness, without the fragility that chloroform had so often exacted. Yet even as relief spread through the ward, there was a lingering awareness, a ghostly scent that whispered of the lessons of the past. Chloroform had taught vigilance, respect, and fear. Ether promised safety, but it did not absolve the responsibility of those who administered it. In every inhalation, in every gentle rise and fall of the chest, there remained the quiet reminder that medicine, no matter how refined, was always a negotiation with mortality. Outside, London's fog pressed against the city. Inside, the ward exhaled softly, breathing in the new vapor, tasting its promise, and remembering the shadow it sought to replace. And in that delicate perfumed air, the city caught a fleeting hope that mercy might yet come without the subtle, suffocating hand of unseen danger. In the marble-clad corridors of the Houses of Parliament, where sunlight fought through fog-streaked windows and dust motes floated like suspended whispers, a small committee gathered to debate what London's hospitals had long known in their quiet, perfumed corridors. Chloroform was both marvel and menace. The air was cool, the scent of ink and wax lingering faintly, and outside, the winter fog clung stubbornly to the streets, curling through alleys and around gas lamps like a living spectre. Inside, the legislators debated the invisible force that had claimed life without sound, that had moved through drawing rooms and nurseries with gentle precision, leaving behind only the faint sweetness of absence. Sir Reginald Whitcomb, seated at the head of the table, tapped his cane against the floor as he reviewed the reports. Each page was meticulously recorded, noting incidents of death, fainting, and perilous dosage. The words were formal, precise, yet the implications were undeniable. Chloroform had claimed lives, and its widespread use in both hospitals and private homes had outpaced the law. The city, the empire itself, had embraced a marvel before understanding its full reach. "Gentlemen," Whitcomb began, his voice measured, "we are faced with a substance that, while hailed as progress, possesses a silent lethality. We have reports numerous of patients succumbing under its influence. Children, adults, mothers in labor. The margin between relief and fatality is narrow, imperceptible, and often fatal." The members of the committee murmured, their expressions a mixture of disbelief, unease, and the habitual reluctance of men accustomed to measured debate rather than confronting invisible danger. The chair of the committee, a portly man with spectacles perched precariously on the bridge of his nose, adjusted his papers. "Surely," he said slowly, "we cannot legislate based upon these anecdotes. The substance has been used successfully countless times. Deaths are unfortunate, but isolated." Sir Whitcomb's gaze, sharp and relentless, swept across the room. "Isolated?" he repeated, his tone low but edged with urgency. 3 children in the East End, a mother in Westminster, a clerk in Fleet Street. Witness testimony corroborates the accounts. These are not mere anomalies. They are patterns, and yet legislation lags. Hospitals continue to administer chloroform, physicians continue to recommend it, parents continue to trust it. A young member, new to Parliament and untested in the subtle dance of political caution, leaned forward. "And what, precisely, do you propose, sir? Shall we outlaw the vapor entirely? Restrict its use? The public would never accept such measures without evidence, proof beyond anecdote, beyond whispered reports." Whitcomb's fingers drummed against the ledger. "The proof is in the ledger itself, in the faint perfume that lingers on hospital linens, on the clothing of victims, in the accounts of nurses and surgeons alike. Chloroform leaves no scar, no mark, no visible trace, but it leaves bodies still, and breath faint, and hearts that falter unnoticed. The law must move before more lives are claimed. Discussions stretched into the evening, debates curling like the fog outside the windows. Some members feared public panic, others feared economic repercussions for apothecaries and hospitals. Yet all were aware, deep beneath their polished rhetoric, that chloroform was an unseen hand sweeping through the city, a sweet, invisible predator whose mercy often masqueraded as malevolence. By nightfall, the committee adjourned, leaving the matter unresolved. Outside, London's gas lamps flickered against the encroaching mist. In hospitals, drawing rooms, and nurseries alike, the perfumed vapor lingered, patient and unyielding. Life continued to trust it, to inhale it, to rely upon it, while the legislation that might have restrained its subtle power remained incomplete, delayed, entangled in bureaucracy, and unable to intervene soon enough. And thus the city continued, wrapped in the quiet, fragrant threat of chloroform, waiting for protection that had been promised but would not arrive before the next breath, delicate, imperceptible, and perilously final. By the turn of the year, whispers of chloroform had become the very fabric of London's society. The city itself seemed to inhale and exhale with caution, as if the fog that pressed against its gas lamps carried both warning and memory. Mothers clutched their children closer in nurseries. Husbands lingered at the doors of surgical theatres with unsteady hands. And even the physicians, once proud of their mastery, moved among patients with subtle, almost trembling care. Chloroform, once celebrated as a marvel of modern medicine, had revealed itself as a spectre, a cure that was as feared as the pain it promised to soothe. In the drawing rooms of Mayfair, ladies whispered behind lace fans, their voices carrying both curiosity and unease. They spoke of infants who had inhaled the delicate vapor and not awoken, of gentlemen who collapsed in parlor demonstrations, and of the quiet deaths recorded in hospital ledgers with meticulous understatement. "It is so subtle," one remarked, her fingers clutching a teacup as if it were a lifeline. "So gentle, and yet it terrifies me beyond words." Fathers paced feverishly through streets fogged with coal smoke and damp air, recalling the accounts of children lost under the guise of mercy. Letters sent to Parliament detailed the incidents with careful propriety, yet the words could not convey the unease that had settled over the nation. The public had embraced chloroform with naive trust, unaware that its sweetness, its elegance, and its silence had begun to dominate the consciousness of both doctors and patients. Fear had arrived, quiet, insidious, and inevitable. Even within hospitals, the change was palpable. Nurses refused to inhale the vapor themselves, preserving their clarity of mind against the subtle seduction of perfumed oblivion. Surgeons counted seconds with unrelenting precision, recognizing that each drop carried a dual promise: relief or irrevocable silence. Apprentices shivered as they observed, learning the skill required not merely to administer medicine, but to navigate the peril it imposed. And yet, despite caution, incidents persisted. The breath that faltered too softly, the heartbeat that slowed too subtly, the life claimed in a moment of inadvertent excess. Dr. Percival Harcourt, one of the city's most experienced physicians, reflected upon the quiet revolution that had overtaken the nation. London had learned, slowly, painfully, that the very substance they had hailed as progress could be both savior and executioner. His own hands shook faintly as he recounted the events of the past months: the child in Fleet Street, the housemaid hidden beneath an attic beam, the gentleman who had inhaled too deeply during a parlor demonstration. Chloroform had taught him that safety was provisional, mercy was perilous, and vigilance was the only true safeguard. Outside, the fog pressed ever tighter against the city, and gas lamps flickered as if shivering under its weight. The streets, narrow and winding, carried the echoes of whispers: mothers cautioning daughters, fathers warning apprentices, midwives reciting cautionary tales in hushed tones. The city itself had learned to fear its own cure, to distrust the perfumed promise that had once seemed so benign, so elegant, so inevitable. In parlors, in nurseries, in operating theatres, the scent lingered, a reminder of fragility, of trust misplaced, of life balanced upon the edge of invisible threads. The nation had embraced chloroform for its promise of mercy, yet it now existed in the collective consciousness as a delicate terror, a fragrant shadow, a silent arbiter of life and death. London breathed cautiously, and the quiet, perfumed menace of the vapour lingered, as patient and as pervasive as the fog that wrapped the city in its cold embrace. And in every inhalation, in every tender administration, the city remembered. A cure could be a threat, and even the sweetest air could carry fear. The dawn was pale and indifferent, casting a diffuse, silvered light over London's rooftops, fog lingering stubbornly in the narrow alleys, pressing against windows and street lamps with a patient, unseen weight. Within the hospitals, operating theatres, and quiet nurseries of the city, the final days of chloroform's unchallenged reign were unfolding. It was no longer a marvel universally celebrated, nor a marvel trusted implicitly. The perfumed vapour, once hailed as mercy, now carried the heavy scent of caution and dread, its elegance tempered by the knowledge of lives claimed quietly, too delicately to notice until it was far too late. Dr. Edward Fairchild stood at the edge of an operating theatre at St. Bartholomew's, his hands steady yet trembling faintly beneath the pressure of history. The small glass vial rested on a velvet-trimmed tray, its contents still glimmering in the cold, grey morning light. The air was heavy with its scent, faint but insistent, curling around the polished instruments, around the iron-framed beds, around the lungs of patients awaiting relief. The vapour had become both familiar and feared, its beauty impossible to deny, its danger impossible to overlook. Across the ward, nurses moved silently, each step measured, each breath guarded. They had learned to respect the potency of chloroform as one respects a tempest, beautiful to behold, impossible to control entirely, and devastating in its unpredictability. They carried their training and experience like talismans, yet even they felt the shadow that lingered in every administration, in every measured drop. It was the quietest of predators, elegant in its cruelty, patient in its work, and ever present in the memory of those who had witnessed its dual nature. A young mother lay in bed number 11, her infant swaddled and trembling beneath the soft light. The child had cried incessantly, her small body racked with fever and discomfort, and the vapour was to be used sparingly, carefully, as a reprieve from suffering. Dr. Fairchild prepared the cloth, folding it with meticulous precision, measuring the drops against the narrow scale of experience. Every motion was deliberate, every breath calculated. Even in its final days as the city's favoured anesthetic, chloroform demanded vigilance. The child inhaled, chest rising and falling with fragile regularity. The vapour, subtle and perfumed, coaxed her into quiet. There was relief, yes, but also the faint tremor of fear in every observer. They had learned that beauty could mask danger, that mercy could arrive wrapped in sweetness, and that even in careful hands, the line between consciousness and oblivion was razor thin. The room held its collective breath, shadows stretching long along the walls, flickering with the wavering gas lamps, until the infant's steady rhythm reassured the attendants. Outside, London breathed cautiously. The fog pressed against the city, shrouding streets, markets, and alleyways in ghostly silver, carrying with it memories of whispered deaths and quiet marvels. The hospitals exhaled as one, the lessons of chloroform imprinted in the minds of surgeons, nurses, and apprentices alike. Its era, glorious and terrifying, was coming to a close, not with the finality of a drum, nor the spectacle of proclamation, but with the quiet acknowledgement of risk, the careful replacement of one vapour with another, and the persistent, perfumed echo of lives touched, saved, or lost beneath its gentle, deadly embrace. Dr. Fairchild set the cloth aside. The vial, empty of the final measure, glimmered softly, a relic of a period in which London had learned the duality of mercy and menace, elegance and danger. He exhaled slowly, aware that history would remember both the marvel and the terror. Chloroform, patient and perfumed, had claimed its place in the city's memory not merely as a cure, but as a reminder that every advancement carried its shadow. And as the lamps burned low, the ward quieted, and London slept beneath fog and soot. The last breath of the chloroform era lingered in the air, sweet, silent, and impossible to forget.